Welcome to the enchanting world of Bella Brown's historical Western romance. I'm delighted to share this journey with you today. Before we ride into the story, if you enjoy these narrations, please consider subscribing to this channel. It's a small gesture that makes a big difference, and your support makes it possible to continue bringing these heartfelt tales to listeners everywhere, completely free of charge. Now find yourself a comfortable spot, close your eyes if you wish, and allow your imagination to travel back to the American frontier, where adventure and romance await. This audiobook presentation features The Baker's Heart by Bella Brown, all rights reserved. Chapter 1. We'll need to start in on the pies first thing tomorrow, Amelia noted as she waited for Nelson to lock the door behind them. I still can't believe just how many blueberries Mr. Jones was able to get to us this time around. And I know with the warm weather that the pies are going to sell wonderfully. Yes, you can make the filling and I'll do the crust. Nelson tucked the key into his pocket as they turned for home. You should let me do the crust. Yours is always a little too bristle. Papa always said the crust needs to snap on the tongue with a crunch, but then melt like butter. Amelia patted her brother on the arm to let him know she was just teasing, though there was a touch of truth in it. If I did the pies, that'd give you plenty of time to get the bread going for the day, though. Nelson made a show of studying the houses and businesses that lined the street on either side. Dusk had settled, and some of the windows were aglow with candlelight already. Amelia walked alongside him in silence. He lapsed into deep thought often these days. It was something she'd caught herself doing, too. She scanned the buildings, too. Snippets of family life carried through the upper open windows, drifting in the evening air, and she was filled with sadness. Everything feels a bit different since Father died, doesn't it? I notice things I didn't before, and yet I also find myself ignoring the things that don't truly matter. I think I'm still sort of in a fog over it all. He's been gone for almost a year now, Nelson noted as he tucked his hands into his trouser pockets. Some days it's as if he's taken one of his trips. On days like today, I can barely remember what he looks like. So much has changed. Jonathan French had always been a whirling dervish of energy. He was a happy and loving father, and when she opened her eyes to see the sun still shining just as brightly as it always had, it was hard to believe that he wasn't still walking this earth with her. You've done very well to step into the breach he left, Amelia told her brother kindly. They were big steps to fill. Everyone has moved on, Nelson continued as they ambled along the sidewalk, ignoring the compliment she'd just paid him. I took over the bakery, and I married Blanche. Amelia consciously stopped herself from making a face. Nelson had been enamored with Blanche from the moment they'd met at a dance last year, and everyone knew the two of them would wed almost from that moment. He seemed happy enough, but there had never been anything but cold civility between the two women. It was certainly none of Amelia's business whom her brother married, and she'd never been certain why Blanche seemed to feel that Amelia was standing in her way. Not that Blanche had said as much, but her eyes had told Amelia all she needed to know. You were going to do that anyway, she countered, whether father was alive or not. Even mother has remarried, Nelson pressed on determinedly, his tone getting sharper with irritation. That made Amelia bite the inside of her lip. She couldn't blame Patricia French at all for so swiftly becoming Patricia Boyd. With the house and the bakery going to build Nelson's future, she could either go find a new life for herself or become a responsibility for her son. Patricia was too proud of a woman to do that, and William Boyd had been a friend of the family for a long time. Perhaps it was a little soon, but she seemed happy. Is there a point to all of this, Nelson? Yes. He stopped and turned to her, his face aglow in the eerie light cast by the hissing street lamps. Amelia, you need to move on as well, she blinked. If you'd rather that I stop talking about father, then I'll do so. Amelia lifted her head and her chin, looking up at her brother with half-lidded eyes. She would do as he asked to keep the peace between them, but he would know that she didn't agree with it. I certainly wouldn't want to upset you. Nelson let out an exasperated sigh as he turned on his heel and continued walking. That's not what I meant. Father is gone. It's sad, and we all miss him, but it's the end of an era. Everyone has to move on from that, and I think it's time you followed suit. What about Mr. Brubaker's son, the one from the mill? He's always happy to see you when he brings in the flour. Now it was Amelia's turn to stop in her tracks. A slow shiver of dread was traveling up and down her spine. What about him? Well, Nelson spun back around and gestured wildly with his hands, as though the answer was right out there in the evening air, if only she was smart enough to grab it. He might be a good suitor. Amelia could only stare at her brother, at the fervent light that shone out of his eyes. She came to realize that this is what he'd spent the past week or so building up to. He'd been plucking up the courage to push her out of the family nest. Are you suggesting that I marry him? I've hardly even spoken to him. But at least you know him, in a sense. I could talk to him if you like. Nelson's hands shoved even further into the confines of his pockets, surely testing the strength of the seams. No, absolutely not. I'll get married if and when I find the right person. At the moment, I'm busy enough keeping the bakery going, not to mention making sure everything is organized at home. She began marching down the street once again, determined to get back to the house as quickly as possible. Her brother was talking nonsense, no doubt spurred on by Blanche. She just had to get into her room and eat her supper, and all would be well. Amelia, she continued, determined to ignore her brother as much as he had her. Amelia usually liked to take a moment to enjoy the way the light slid over the sides of Greenville's buildings as the sun sank, or how it danced across the river that rolled through the middle of the town. This evening, she ignored them as she charged for home. Marrying a perfect stranger. How could he even contemplate such a thing? Amelia. Nelson had caught up to her now, and he grabbed her elbow. You're not being sensible about this, which surprises me. Father always said you were the sensible one. Clearly, he's right, since you're the one who thinks I should just go ahead and marry the miller's son simply because he's there. She yanked her elbow out of his grip. Then it doesn't have to be him. It could be someone else. He let out a low growl as he was forced to catch up to her once again. Honestly, Amelia, all of your friends are married or about to be. You're 23 years old. There's no reason why you shouldn't be walking down the aisle as well. Other than the fact that I don't want to? She challenged. Amelia and Nelson had often butted heads as they grew up. Nelson was impulsive and bullheaded, whereas Amelia was controlled and polite. She didn't feel particularly polite at this moment, however. Do you think Papa would have bundled me off to the first available man? What would he say to this outlandish idea? Father isn't the one having to make room for you in his house. I am. She'd just turned up the walkway to their home, the one they had both been born and raised in. His face was shadows and relief, giving him a menacing air when she whirled on him, temper snapping in her veins. What? Person. Blanche and I are trying to start a new life together. We can't exactly do that with you around. I was kind enough to let you stay for a while. I thought it only appropriate that you had plenty of time to grieve. But that time is over now, and you need to either marry or find some other way to move out of the house. He'd pulled his hands out of his pockets now, standing tall and looking down at her. Pain rippled through her heart. So, you would just throw me out, without so much as a warning? If you were already feeling this way, then you should have told me a long time ago. Besides, I do an awful lot of work around this house. It's because of me that it's kept up the way it is, so I take quite the load off of Blanche. Nelson rolled his eyes toward the darkening sky. Don't you understand? That's exactly the problem. You're trying to run the household, but that's her job. You're not taking a load off of her shoulders. You're taking over the life she wants to have. You're in her way, and you're in the way of our happiness. Here was the crux of the problem. Amelia sighed. Nelson looked plenty proud and authoritative right now, but did he look that way when Blanche told him what she wanted? Did he even think to argue in his sister's favor? Amelia highly doubted it. I see. Well, if that's the way it is, then I'll just have to do something about it. Without giving him a chance to say anything else, Amelia went into the house. She slowed her thundering footsteps in the foyer, not wanting to grab Blanche's attention any more than she already had. Familiar scents of beeswax and dust tickled her senses. This house was all she had ever known. She'd not even protested when her father's will had been read and everything had been left to Nelson. After all, he was the only son, and that was how it should be. But she was almost certain that her father wouldn't want her marrying a miller's son, nor did he mean for Nelson to cast her out. She looked up at the beautiful walnut staircase that opened wide at the bottom and invited her to the second level of the home. On her right was the parlor, where she and her family had spent so many evenings together. On her left was the library, where her father had taught her to read before she was even old enough to go to school. There were such wonderful memories here. It seemed that memories were going to be the only things she'd have left of her life in this lovely house. Chapter 2. Good morning, Amelia. Amelia's spine stiffened as she heard Blanche come into the kitchen. She'd arisen early, something she'd been accustomed to doing for quite some time, ever since she'd first started helping her father out at the bakery. "You have to rise early if you want your bread to rise divine," he used to say with a wink. It had become such a habit that Amelia found herself often rising before the sun even when the bakery was closed. Now, she did it more to avoid Blanche than anything else. Her sister-in-law was most certainly not an early riser, languishing in bed most days until nearly noon. For the most part, that made it a little easier not to have to see her. Today appeared to be an exception. "Good morning." She hoped she sounded pleasant, even though she didn't feel it. "Do you have any plans for the day?" Blanche pressed. Amelia could count on one hand, since her brother had announced his marital intentions towards Blanche, the number of times that her sister-in-law had deliberately struck up a conversation with her. The more cynical voice in Amelia's head couldn't help but wonder what she was up to. "No, I don't think so." "Really? Weren't you thinking about having the guest bedroom repapered sometime soon?" "Perhaps I misheard you." Blanche patted her white blonde hair into place, though not a hair had gone astray. Amelia was acutely aware of the maids hovering in the pantry, no doubt cocking their ears to listen in. She had been planning to replace the peeling wallpaper in the guest bedroom, and she'd chosen a beautiful blue paper with dainty peach-colored irises on. Amelia had canceled the whole thing the moment Nelson had made his announcement that she was to leave. She'd wondered if Blanche knew about their conversation, although she was now quite convinced that Nelson had told his dear wife everything. She never would have imagined she'd feel quite so uncomfortable in her own home as she had in the past month or so. "There doesn't seem to be much point now. Perhaps you should pick something and have it taken care of." Blanche casually strolled over to take a teacup from the hutch and added the liquid from the pot that sat on the scrubbed table. "I wouldn't want to take over something you were so interested in." Amelia studied the coffee cup in her hands, wishing that the oven would do its work faster, just so that she could escape. Better yet, Blanche would simply take her tea in bed the same way she usually did. Blanche was just teasing her now, judging by the malevolent light dancing in her sky-blue eyes. Or perhaps she was testing her to see if she was truly willing to give up the running of this household. If anything, the past week should have told Blanche all she needed to know. Amelia had hardly even picked up a polishing rag since that fateful evening. "It doesn't matter to me anymore." Blanche's eyebrow ticked up as she dropped 2 lumps of sugar into her cup. "And why is that?" Amelia hesitated. Nelson's plan for her to marry someone simply wasn't going to happen. She didn't have anyone in mind that she was interested in. Even if she had, she'd want to have time for the two of them to get to know each other. There simply wasn't time for that, not considering how badly Nelson and Blanche wanted her out. And now that she knew they wanted her out, she most certainly didn't want to be here. So, Amelia had no choice but to find some other way to support herself. There was no chance that she'd ask her mother and Mr. Boyd if she could come and stay with them, even if she promised to pull her own weight. She'd been devastated and desperate, but then a customer had left their newspaper at the bakery, and the answer to her prayers lay within. Amelia hadn't yet told anyone of her plan. She had wanted to wait until she knew without any doubt that it was happening. That hadn't happened yet, but she couldn't stand Blanche's needling or snide smirks any longer. Because I'm going to be moving soon, I've taken a position on a ranch in Wyoming. I have a few preparations to do, but the house will be all yours once I'm gone. It makes sense that you should do all of the redecorating, Blanche. I do wish you the best of luck with it. Her coffee sloshed over the rim of her cup as she turned and pushed through the kitchen door, leaving a flabbergasted Blanche behind her. The mail had just come through the slot as she headed for the stairs, and Amelia whisked it off the floor. She clutched it tightly in her hand on the way to her room. There were plenty of other jobs advertised in the paper, and if she didn't hear back on this one, then she'd apply for another one. She'd even seen men who'd gone out west in search of their fortunes now turning back east to find a wife, but she'd already decided she wasn't interested in marriage. In the privacy of her room, Amelia flipped through the envelopes. When she saw her name in an unfamiliar hand, her heart jumped up into her throat. The day she'd collected the newspaper off the bakery counter had been a bad one. She'd spent the morning quarreling with Nelson, burned 2 batches of cookies, and had been subjected to Joseph Brubaker and his rancid breath. The newspaper hadn't been folded properly, and the sheets had dropped out from between the folds. If not for the wording of the advertisement, she might never have seen applying for a job elsewhere as an option for her. Cook wanted for large Wyoming ranch. Room and board are provided on top of wages. Amelia could bake. She'd been doing it her entire life. But cook? Well, she'd certainly done a bit of cooking here and there, but her skills left something to be desired, particularly if she was going to get paid to do it. Still, she'd sent off a letter as quickly as she could that day. It was a chance, granted, but it also wasn't a Brubaker future. She'd rather take her chances with the unknown than settle for a life with Joseph. Her hands shook as she ripped open the seal and shook out the reply. Perhaps the position had already been filled. Surely there was someone out in Wyoming who'd wanted the job faster than it'd taken for her application to get there. But even if this was a rejection, Amelia promised herself she'd keep pressing forward. With a deep breath, she unfolded the small sheet. Amelia read the letter, and then she read it again. She was still standing there in the middle of her room when the heavy knock sounded on the door, giving her a jolt. Amelia! She hardly even heard the aggravation in Nelson's voice, thinking only instead of her own elation. "Come in," Nelson burst in. "What is this I hear about you moving off to Montana?" "Wyoming," she corrected him, checking the envelope. "Sheridan, Wyoming." Her brother didn't seem to care about the location all that much. "Is this some joke to you?" Amelia's hands dropped to her sides. "Excuse me?" He pointed down through the floor. "Blanche just came to me with some story about you taking a position on a ranch. I know you're angry with me, but that's no reason to make up silly stories and try to make Blanche look like a fool." "Nelson, you're the fool," Amelia huffed, putting her hands on her hips. "I am taking a position at a ranch in Wyoming. You were the one who said I needed to move out of the house. I'm doing exactly as you asked, so I don't see any reason why you should be angry with me." Because you can't simply jump on a train, go halfway across the country, and go work for a stranger. "Why not?" She flapped the letter in the air. "People do it all the time." "It's dangerous, for one thing. For another, I thought you'd continue to work at the bakery. It was our father who started it, if you recall." Amelia knew that she needed to respect her brother. He was the head of the family now that father was gone. But he wasn't acting like it right now. She felt herself shaking down to her very bones. "How dare you throw that in my face? You told me that you wanted me out of your way." "Exactly. The house, not the business. And you think by becoming a wife I'll be able to continue to work?" Her voice has risen to match that of her brother's. "I'll have to do my husband's bidding, and no man would be happy with the hours that I keep." Nelson's mouth snapped shut, and Amelia could tell that he'd not considered that aspect. "Well, I would speak to Joseph. You can't have it both ways, Nelson. I forbid you from leaving. You are to stay here, in this town." Amelia folded her arms to keep them from throwing something at him in temper. "Just not in this house?" Nelson nodded once, apparently relieved at the saccharine tone she was using. "Yes. This is becoming a habit with you, Nelson, where you bend everything around you to your bidding. Fortunately, it's something that I won't be around to observe for much longer. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some packing to do." She turned and pulled a valise out from under her bed before purposely walking to her wardrobe and opening its doors wide. Nelson stood behind her for a moment, fuming, but she finally heard him leave. When the door clicked shut behind him, she slumped down onto the side of the bed. She had the job. Now she just had to hope that she could do it. Chapter 3. Matthew Whitman bolted upright in bed when he heard the pounding on the door. Without lighting a lamp, he leaped off the mattress and yanked on his pants. Snatching his pistol off the dresser, he moved swiftly through the house toward the front door. It wasn't often that they had trouble out here in Sheridan, but he was ready for it if it came. Matthew paused in the front room and slowly peeled the curtain back. Sheriff Hale stood at the top of the porch steps, supporting a slumping figure with one arm. "Open up, Whitman. I've got another one of yours." With a sigh, Matthew flung the curtain back in place. He set the pistol aside and unbarred the door. "Please tell me you're mistaken," he said when he stepped out onto the porch. The boards were cool and rough under his bare feet. "You tell me." Sheriff Hale hauled the sagging figure upright. "Sure looks like Fletcher Small to me, and last I knew he was living here. Unfortunately. Give me just a second." Slipping back into the house, he dipped a cup of water from the bucket. "You might want to stand aside, Sheriff." Unsupported, Fletcher began to wobble. When the cold water splashed him in his face and down his shoulders, he spluttered and flailed, but he was certainly awake. "What did you do that for?" "Same reason I do it to any of the rest of you who come back in this condition, particularly when you're brought in by the sheriff or one of his men," Matthew replied tersely. "You're drunk, Fletcher." The ranch hand gave a limp shrug. "So, what's a few beers? I make good money." "A few too many is more like it," Hale replied, shaking his head. "I got called to the saloon when Fletcher here decided it'd be a good idea to pick a fight with Jasper Keating. He's lucky his buddies stopped it before things got worse than they did." Matthew swiped a hand down his face. Jasper Keating was probably the biggest man in the county, and he had to be at least 4 times the size of the slim Fletcher. That's liable to get you a headache far worse than the one you're going to have in the morning from all that beer. Whiskey. Fletcher leaned against the porch for support and blinked, his eyes never opening more than halfway. "I don't care if it's tequila. You're still getting up in the morning to do your job, and I don't want to hear a single complaint." Matthew grabbed Fletcher by the shoulders, turned him around, and marched him down the steps. "Get to the bunkhouse and get to bed." "I just wanted some dinner," Fletcher groused as he lurched into the night. Sheriff Hale took off his hat and ran a hand through his graying hair. "You think he can find his way?" The bunkhouse wasn't far from the main house on the Whitman ranch. The dirt path was illuminated with moonlight, and Fletcher seemed to be stumbling along it well enough. If not, he'll have a fun surprise when he wakes up and finds himself in the vegetable patch. Thanks for bringing him back before he could cause any more trouble. "I'd say you're welcome, but this is starting to become quite the habit," the lawman noted as he settled himself down in a rocking chair on the porch. "It seems like it's just about every night that I'm rounding up one or another of your men. I'm not going to keep bringing them back here, Matthew." He didn't need to say it for Matthew to know what Hale meant. He was doing him a favor by not throwing the ranch hands in jail and making them sleep off their alcohol behind bars. "I know. I understand. You know, Matthew, I took on the job of sheriff because I wanted to keep things peaceful and happy here in Sheridan, or at least as peaceful as they possibly could be. I don't delude myself by thinking that things are always going to be perfect and easy. I do think, however, that a little bit of effort can go a long way. There's got to be something more you can do." Matthew shuffled over to the other rocker. He and Jane used to sit out here in the evenings and watch the sunset. Those days felt like forever ago now. Too much had changed, and none of it for the better. "I'm working on it." "Is that so?" Hale's spurs jingled softly as he pushed back in his chair. "You see, The problem is that I need a lot of help here to keep this operation going. That's all fine and dandy. I offer good wages, and the bunkhouse is pretty decent. But ever since Ma passed away, I haven't had anyone around to feed them. Oh, one of them will throw something together once in a while, but it's never anything truly worth eating. So they all head into town at the end of the day to get a bite to eat. The sheriff nodded. They have a beer with dinner, and that becomes 2, and then 3. Right. If I just had someone here to cook for them, then they wouldn't have nearly as much reason to go into town. They didn't get into this kind of trouble when Ma was here. Matthew's mother had kept all these young men rounded up and in line as though they were her own boys. They might be rough and rugged while they were in the saddle, but they knew never to spit in the yard or curse in her presence. Matthew knew he could keep the men in check when it came to doing their jobs, but they still needed to be fed somehow. I've already placed an advert for a cook. I hope it doesn't take long, Matthew, because I am at the end of my patience with this. I've already got it all taken care of, he promised. There's a woman on her way from North Carolina right now. I admit I had doubts about putting out an advert back east, but so few folks are available here. Once she gets all settled in, I imagine everything is going to quiet down around here. Well, that's music to my ears, son, and that's the truth. I'll let you get back to bed then. The sheriff stood and put his hat back on his head. You have a good evening? You too, Sheriff, and thanks again. But Matthew didn't go back to bed, even once the sheriff had ridden off toward town. He stayed there in the rocking chair, looking out over the land and thinking. He'd taken on this ranch because he'd wanted to make a good living. There'd been a real purpose behind that, once. Now he couldn't be so sure. Yes, he provided jobs for several hands, and there was a certain sense of satisfaction in knowing he was raising meat that was filling the bellies of his fellow Americans. It didn't feel the same, though, as it used to. Matthew was used to hard work, and he didn't mind it a bit, but he wished he still had a reason to do it all. Stop feeling sorry for yourself, he mumbled as he stood up and stretched. Take your sorry hind end back to bed. That cook will get here within a few days and ease your troubles. Then you won't be thinking like this. Some sleep will do you some good, too. He headed back into the house and collapsed into bed, dreading the sunrise when he'd have to drag Fletcher out of bed by his ankles and make him work a full day in the saddle to make up for his ill behavior. Chapter 4. Darn it. Matthew sighed as he dug his spoon down to the bottom of the pot and could tell that he'd once again burned the stew. Ma had always made it look so easy, just throwing everything in the biggest pot they owned and letting it cook all day. The meat was tender, the potatoes perfectly done, and the gravy so delicious that not a drop of it went to waste. She, however, had never ended up with a thick scab of burned blackness in the bottom of the pan. There was nothing for it, though. Matthew had to eat, so he grabbed a bowl from the hutch. As he crossed the room, he spotted a figure in his peripheral vision coming up the drive. He stopped and backed up to get a closer look, blinking in the sunshine. They didn't get many visitors this far out of town. Anyone who showed up on the Whitman ranch either knew where they were going or were completely lost. He waited for a moment, wondering which was the case right now. As the figure drew closer, his confusion only increased. It was clearly a woman, but it wasn't the cook he'd been expecting. This was a young woman, her fine figure perfectly outlined in her dark green dress. Her rose gold hair was expertly captured under her hat, and she held her chin high as she strolled toward the house. The closer she came, the worse feeling he had about her. This had happened before, and he was looking forward to it ending. He opened the front door just as the woman had lifted her hand to knock. "Can I help you?" he barked. She blinked, a momentary flutter over her moss-green eyes, but she gave him a small smile. "Yes, I was certainly hoping so. Am I at the Whitman Ranch?" "You are." He leaned against the doorframe. "Which one of them are you after?" "Excuse me?" She took the slightest uncertain step backward. "Don't play games with me, lady." Matthew's stomach grumbled, giving him even less patience for this situation than he'd started out with. "I know how this works. One of my ranch hands comes stumbling into the saloon after supper. He's drunk as a skunk, so he takes one look at your pretty face and thinks he's in love. You see that he's a good meal ticket for you, and how dare you? The woman took a more determined step backward now, a spark of fury coming into those emerald eyes. He put his hands up, palms out. I'm not judging you, sweetheart. It happens. But I highly doubt any of my workers are all that intent on walking down the aisle, no matter what promises were made to you in the throes of drunken passion. If you thought you could come here this morning and pin him down on some drunk proposal, then I suggest you turn yourself right back around and head right back on into town. Even he had to admit that the fury sparkling in her eyes made her all the more attractive, and he found his mind picturing and discarding his ranch hands in an attempt to match her to one of them. None of them deserved a woman who looked as good as she did. Her jaw flexed as she set her case at her feet. Her hands went to her hips as she glared. I'm looking for a Mr. Matthew Whitman? He narrowed his eyes. Who's asking? My name is Amelia French. I was offered a job here as a cook. His stomach dropped down into his shoes, and all thoughts of his burnt stew were forgotten. Oh, am I to assume by that noise that you are Mr. Whitman? Matthew swallowed, and he rubbed the back of his neck ruefully. Please, Mr. Whitman. Her hand came up, palm out, and her tone brooked no arguments. Don't embarrass us both with a pointless apology. I most certainly won't be working here if I'm going to get accused of something so appalling the moment I step on your property. She snatched up her valise, and with a whirl of her skirts, she quickly headed back down the porch stairs. Momentarily, he was stunned. He hadn't been put back in his place by a woman since, well, in quite some time. She was halfway across his yard before he realized his cook, the answer to his and the sheriff's problems, was walking away from him. Hold on. She continued to walk, her nose in the air, fury rolling off her stiff shoulders. Now, hold on. He tried again, skipping the last couple of stairs and catching up to her with a few long strides. It was a simple mistake. A mistake is calling a person by the wrong name. What you just did was to pass judgment, Mr. Whitman. She was almost trotting, but he matched her hurried pace easily. In my defense, you don't look much like a cook. Her snort was anything but ladylike. I'm terribly sorry. I'll be sure to wear my apron and carry a wooden spoon in my hand next time. Her chin was still set and hard, but he thought he saw tears glistening in the corners of her eyes. He'd really done it this time. I don't mean like that. I'm hiring a cook for a big group of rough and rowdy ranch hands. I thought you'd be. He picked and discarded several adjectives. Older. He winced as his reply sounded insulting even to his ears. Older? Somehow he'd imagined a stout, matronly woman instead of someone so petite. Matthew hadn't thought she'd be so pretty, either. You know, a matron, someone who can help me keep them all in line. My mother was the one who used to do it, and I'm sure she never got accused of trying to trap one of them into marriage, Miss French snapped. No, she didn't. Listen, I really am sorry about the mix-up. I'm sure if we can talk about it, we can get it all figured out. Desperation moved through him. She was too pretty and too young for a job like this. The men in his bunkhouse would trip over themselves for her as soon as they got one look at her. She'd never survive, but his ma had taught him that beggars couldn't be choosers, and right now, he was desperate for someone to do the job. The delectable Miss French was his only shot. She stopped abruptly and faced him. Up close, she was even prettier, and for a moment, his stuttering mind had a hard time keeping up with the words that were coming out of her mouth. Mr. Whitman, I'm surprised that you're still able to walk, considering how much you like to put your foot in your mouth. You've done nothing but insult me since I arrived. I will no longer be taking the position. Kindly stop following me. She was stomping off once more, kicking up a steady cloud of dust behind her as she made her way down the drive. Miss French, please. He knew she could hear him, but that didn't matter. She wasn't stopping. What was that all about? Matthew turned to see Arlie ambling up behind him, leading his horse by the reins. The chief ranch hand seemed as if he'd been born in the saddle. The gray streaks in his hair and beard were beginning to take over, but he could still more than keep up with all the younger men. His calm and sure nature had been one of the main things that had made Matthew hire him all these years ago, and it was exactly why he'd kept him on. "I hired a new cook, and she already quit. Your ugly mug made her run away that fast, huh?" Arlie asked with a grin. He wished he could see the humor in his jibe, but right now he was more concerned about the future of his ranch. "I thought she was one of the saloon girls coming here to rope one of the men into marriage." Arlie's wiry brows disappeared under his hat. He ruminated a moment, his sharp eyes tracking the solitary figure toward the end of the drive. "I reckon she was a bit insulted by that." "You can say that again," Matthew grumbled. "She quit before she'd even stepped foot through the door. How was I to know she was my new employee? She doesn't look much like a cook to me." "What does a cook look like to you?" Miss French was easy to follow in her pretty dress, her fiery hair visible from afar as she walked along the road that bordered the edges of his land. He sighed and shrugged. Arlie nodded. "Well, I'm sure the eateries in town enjoy the extra business of having our men visit. Sheriff Hale certainly enjoys bringing the likes of Fletcher back here for us. He don't complain much about that at all, does he?" Matthew's mouth twisted in annoyance. The applicants for the post had been thin on the ground. Maybe the thought of feeding a bunch of rowdy cowpokes wasn't such a pleasant thought for women, and that's why he'd not had many applicants. How many more weeks would it take to place another advert and answer the letters on top of his other duties? Meanwhile, Sheriff Hale would be back here to chew him out again, probably with a bunch of fines in his back pocket for the damage that one of his hands had done in the saloon. Matthew would have to go bail the men out, which would be time away from the ranch. Catastrophe after catastrophe raced through his mind, making his guts boil. "Heck, are you going to dilly-dally here all day like a debutante waiting on her first dance?" Matthew looked at the older man. "What?" Arlie gestured at the woman's retreating figure. "She isn't gone yet. You need a cook. I don't see anyone else banging down the doors to live in the wilds and feed a bunch of hungry, filthy fellas." "I don't know, Arlie. She already told me she wasn't going to work here." The older man shrugged. "How do you normally fix things with a woman when you're in the wrong? There's a lot that can be fixed with a sincere apology." "Hat in hand, huh?" Matthew reached out. "Give me that horse, Arlie. The woman is a fast walker." Swinging up into the saddle, he nudged the horse into an easy gallop and caught up with Miss French in a moment. She looked as though she was just going to keep walking, and so he swung his mount around in front of her. Matthew dropped to the ground. Thinking of Arlie, he swiped his hat off his head. This had to be good, or else it wasn't going to work. "Miss French, I really do beg your forgiveness. I was a stupid oaf, and I said some terrible things. I made assumptions about you, and I can completely understand why you're angry with me." Since he was blocking her path, Miss French had no choice but to look up at him. When she did, Matthew could see that 2 tears had made long, wet streaks in the dust on her cheeks. His gut clenched at the sight, and it made him feel awful. He really had upset her. She swiped them away quickly, but it was already too late. "If you think you're a stupid oaf, then there's at least one thing we can agree on." "That's a start," he replied hopefully. He sighed, tracing the green eyes and creamy skin. Surely she was going to be eaten alive around here. He reminded himself that he needed a cook and to focus on the job at hand, getting her to stay. "You've come all this way for the job. Come back up to the house and give me a second chance. I promise I won't try to marry you off to one of my ranch hands again." A hint of a smile played on her petal-pink lips, and she chased it away with a nip from her teeth. "Very well." His mouth hooked up, and he took her case from her, attaching it to the saddle. "I'm perfectly capable of carrying that," she told him. "I'm sure you are, but my mama raised me right, except when it comes to insulting strangers, of course." Matthew easily mounted the horse and held a hand down to her. Miss French remained where she was, eyeballing both him and the horse. "Let me at least spare you the walk back," he pleaded, wondering how much he'd have to grovel before she'd agree. With a petulant look, she set her gloved hand in his palm. "I suppose that would be nice, but I'm not sure how. Oh!" In one swift movement, Matthew pulled her up in front of him, seating her sideways. He wrapped his arm around her waist to keep her secure, trying not to notice that she smelled like lilacs. "You just relax now," he murmured, though she remained rigid in his arms, her eyes darting about her as the horse started walking. "Easier said than done," she muttered. "It's easier when you're facing frontways," he said. An awkward silence descended upon them. He realized that he should have just walked back beside her. Her scent was tantalizing. Wordlessly, they made their way back up the drive. Matthew bit back a sigh when he spotted Arlie and the others lining up outside the bunkhouse. Each man wore an expression of curiosity and humor, with differing levels of interest shining there. As Matthew held Miss French's slim figure in front of him, he once again had to wonder if she was truly right for the job. Chapter 5. Amelia finished tucking her hair into place and checked her appearance in the tiny mirror. The men were right. She didn't even look like a cook, and she certainly didn't feel like one. Matthew Whitman had called it. She wasn't sure which had upset her more, his dreadfully rude accusations, or the fact that his dismissal of her had played right into her doubts. She wasn't a cook. She was a baker. Yes, she could make enough bread and muffins to feed many mouths. But what did ranch hands eat? Turning away from the mirror, she stepped over to the window of the small room up in the eaves of the house that she'd been given to use as her own. She'd expected to have her own accommodation, but Matthew Whitman had taken one look at his men and marched her inside the main house. The tiny room was sparse, but she'd expected as much, considering she was moving all the way out onto the frontier. Instead of the large four-poster bed that she'd slept in back in Greenville, she had a mattress that was little more than a cot. A washstand and a small wardrobe, both of which looked to be handmade, sat against the wall and left just enough room for her to squeeze past them to the bed. It was all a far cry from what she was used to, but Amelia wouldn't feel sorry for herself. The main house stood stately, a grand dwelling built of solid oak nestled amidst the endless fields. The porch, laced with blooming honeysuckle and jasmine, added a touch of nature's elegance to the rugged landscape. The interior had been as expected, furnished with simply rustic furniture, practical and functional for a man who'd built his livelihood by working the land. She'd been sure that she wouldn't sleep a wink, but exhaustion from traveling for days had finally claimed her. Thankfully, Mr. Whitman had let her off having to make breakfast, giving her a day to settle in and prepare the evening meal. She rested her elbows on the sill, looking out over the gently rolling hills. The day was blustery, chasing gray clouds across the sky. Majestic oak trees stood like sentinels at the property's edge, their leaves whispering in the morning wind. To the west lay the barn, a proud structure painted in a hue of red so deep it could compete with the sunrise. The bunkhouse was a single-story building, low and squat, tucked up between outbuildings and stables. The yard was cluttered with detritus of ranch life. Rusted contraptions and wagon wheels leaned against the fences. Several dogs peeked out of kennels, and the clucking hens added a harmonious rhythm to the symphony of the ranch. Around the homestead, fields of alfalfa and clover stretched to the horizon, their sweet scent wafting on the breeze, mingling with the earthy aroma of the surrounding pines. Beyond those fields, cows grazed a patchwork of grassy knolls. The fence that ran the perimeter was dotted with wildflowers that lent a splash of color against the earthen tones. The soft gurgling of the nearby stream was a soothing serenade, a consistent comfort in an ever-changing world. The water, fresh from the Laramie Mountains, glinted in the early light, its banks abundant with wild lilies and buttercups. This was a beautiful place, one that she never would have seen if she hadn't been forced to come here. Amelia let out a long breath, hoping it would also help her let go of all the anger she still felt toward her brother. Though he'd let her pack her things in relative peace, he had badgered her constantly. He wanted her to stay. She had a duty to him. Why was she being so unreasonable? When his cajoling hadn't worked, he'd grown more incensed. No amount of explaining to him that he'd been the one to push her out of the home and his life worked. Her brother wouldn't accept that his words had left her with no choice. It wasn't until she'd taken her seat on the train that she found a moment of peace. She was leaving her old life behind, heading for a job that she wasn't even sure she could do. A job that wouldn't get done if she whiled away her hours gazing out of the window. She had 10 hungry mouths to feed. She made her way downstairs and into the kitchen. Naively, when she'd applied for the job, she hadn't imagined that she'd have to cook for so many. The job had been selected because it was a skill set she had some experience with, and it was different from the seamstress and service jobs that she'd seen. "You can cook, Amelia," she told herself as she began looking through the cupboards to see what sort of ingredients were available. With each door she opened, though, her confidence plummeted. She should have asked how long it had been since there had been a cook at the ranch. The cupboards were mostly bare, and she started to wish that she hadn't promised Mr. Whitman that she'd have the first meal ready that night. She'd have to either go into town herself or send someone else in short order. Stepping down into the coolness of the root cellar, Amelia remembered yet another phrase from her father. "Always buy more than you think you're going to need. You'll be glad you did later." The silly old man would always smile and raise his eyebrows when he said those sorts of things, delighted with himself. Back in Greenville, however, Amelia hadn't ever worried if she'd have enough. If they ran out of something, it wasn't all that hard to either borrow some from a neighbor or simply buy more. Out here, however, running short of something was going to be very different. It took several trips up and down the steps of the root cellar before she finally felt that she was ready to cook. More time still to get the large iron belly stove working and heated up. Her mind was racing and her heart thundering with nerves as she finally had the meal cooking away on the stovetop. She whipped up the dough for the bread and had that baking. That, at least, she knew how to do well. Struck by a thought, she hurried down to the root cellar and carried up the last of the apples she'd discovered. Next, she focused on the main meal. Living on a cattle ranch meant there was never a shortage of beef, and so she had a side of meat roasting in the pan, with onions, cabbage, and potatoes too. Amelia flitted from one side of the kitchen to the other, and then back down into the cellar, putting together a meal that she was sure was going to dazzle her new boss. Much of that confidence dissolved when she heard the cowhands coming in the front door, returning from a hard day of grafting. "Something smells good. This might be worth skipping the saloon after all. I'm starving." With the platter in her hands, Amelia swept out of the kitchen. She felt the men's eyes on her as she loaded the big dining table down with a huge platter of meat, a bowl of mashed potatoes, and another of roasted vegetables. She only lifted her eyes to Mr. Whitman, who'd seated himself at the head of the table. He gave her a nod as he loaded his plate. Amelia hurried back into the kitchen and leaned against the wall. The first one was over. She did not doubt that it was the hardest meal she'd ever had to make, and she hadn't realized until now just how much she'd appreciated her mother's cooking. Amelia thought it might be nice to write her mother a letter tonight to let her know she was getting settled in. She might even have some good recipes to share. For now, however, it was time for her to eat. She'd made herself a plate of food that she'd set aside in the warmer before the rest of it had gone out to the men, and she dug in. The pure joy and accomplishment she'd felt at creating this meal melted faster than the pat of butter on top of the potatoes, which were runny and mealy. The beef was no better, considering she could chew the leather of her boots better than she could the meat on her plate. The vegetables were the least offensive, but Amelia quickly found out that broccoli tasted terrible when it was overcooked around the edges. She frowned down at her plate. Could she truly be that bad at cooking? Had she gone through her entire life in a bakery, learning how to make the flakiest pie crusts and the softest bread without knowing how to make a simple roast? Her eyes darted over to the sideboard, where the one last remaining part of her meal still waited. Though Amelia had been overly optimistic about the dinner, she knew her confidence about this last part was well-deserved. She picked up the plate and sucked in a breath before flying back out into the dining room. She felt all of their eyes on her as she stepped through the door. The atmosphere was tense, and she felt the weight of all their stares. She risked a look at the plates. It seemed to her as though hardly anything had been touched. If she couldn't eat her meal, how could she expect them to eat theirs? In response, her cheeks heated, and she didn't look at a single one of them. Not even Mr. Whitman, just in case she saw anger there. Grateful to see an open spot on the table, Amelia set the plate down and disappeared back into the relative safety of the kitchen. She leaned back against the door, resting her head on it as she held back the tears that wanted to fall. Why, oh why, did she take on such a task? She was a fool. She had nowhere to go from here. Returning home simply wasn't an option. She wouldn't go where she wasn't wanted. So what then? She sniffed deeply, swallowing down the ball of emotion that gripped her throat. Her eyes moved around the kitchen. A hand-sewn gingham curtain fluttered gently in the breeze that trickled in, casting playful patterns on the ancient stone floor. The cookware, blackened from years of use, hung from iron hooks above the large, scarred oak table. A few odd and half-empty mason jars lined the wooden shelves, their contents a colorful display of preserved summer fruits and homemade pickles. Not of it felt familiar, and she found herself filled with homesickness, which was crazy. She no longer had a home to go to. Perhaps she could get a position somewhere else, somewhere she didn't have to make sure that 10 men had their stomachs full every evening. She pushed away from the door and began to hunt. Amelia found a piece of paper in a drawer and sat down at the table. It didn't take long before the kitchen door opened inwards, and Matthew Whitman loomed there. For a moment, her heart tripped over itself as his dark blue eyes roamed around the mess she'd created. When he wasn't being rude, he was a very handsome man. Unbidden, memories of being held in place by those strong arms yesterday burst through her mind's eye, and her cheeks heated once more. She broke the look and focused on her notes instead. Your application stated that you had many years of cooking experience. His voice was cool and clipped, much like it had been when he'd met her at the front door yesterday. Her pulse skittered into her throat as cold dread trickled through her gut. Whilst it hadn't been a lie, it also wasn't the truth. What she'd written was that she had kitchen experience, which implied that she had cooking experience. She didn't trust her voice and was working on holding back the tears again, so she simply nodded. Judging by that slop you've just served me and my men, I'd have to disagree. Her jaw ached with the Herculean effort of not allowing herself to cry in front of him once more. She folded her arms and arched a brow at him. He was right, of course, but she wasn't about to admit it. He pushed the door shut behind him and then pressed his flat palms to the table and leaned forward, eyes flinty. Did you lie to me? Not really, she replied coolly, determined not to let him upset her once again. His nostrils flared white. Explain. I have kitchen experience, she clarified, and was about to tell him that it was a baker's kitchen when he reared back, annoyed. Miss French, I hired you because you said you had experience. What you just put out there was hardly good enough for the pig. My men don't have sophisticated palates, but that food was even dreadful, even by their standards. I'm in a rather desperate way, and I don't have time to be messed around. I don't just want to have a cook here. I need one. Do you understand me? If you're not up for the job, why in the blazes did you come all this way just to waste my time? There were many lessons her father had taught her, and one of them was to always own up to her mistakes. This was absolutely one of them. She could try to make excuses. She could beg and plead, but she wouldn't. I agree. Matthew straightened and put his hands on his narrow hips, a contrast to his wide shoulders, eyeing her suspiciously. What? I agree with you. That meal was awful. I dried the beef out and the potatoes were grainy. He stared at her for a few more moments, trying to work her out. His hands dropped to his sides, then went back to his hips. She sighed softly. She hadn't exactly been honest when she'd written to him regarding the job. Perhaps it was time to do so now. I may have stretched the truth when I told you I was used to feeding many people at the same time. I truly did, but not in the way I suggested. You see, I grew up in my father's bakery. I have kitchen experience. Her fingers danced awkwardly in the air in front of her. Just not cooking experience per se. He paced through the room, his boots making hollow thuds against the wooden floorboards as he walked off whatever temper she saw there. He moved easily as if commanding the space he filled and knowing his place in the world. She envied him that confidence. She was still admiring his rangy form when he spun back to face her. That explains the molasses stack cake then. Now she smiled, though she knew she probably shouldn't. Did you like it? His black brow shot up, and she could tell he didn't share her humor or the compliment search. He allowed her a brisk nod. The bread, too? She nodded. Yes. He harumphed, paced a little more, and then stopped at the head of the table. His eyes fell on the paper in front of her. What's that? A shopping list. A list of my skills for when I apply to my next post. His mouth firmed in annoyance. You go to town first thing tomorrow. You get whatever you need from the stores. I have several accounts at the bigger stores, or I can give you some money should you need it. Slowly, Amelia looked up at him. She thought for certain she'd be fired. I don't understand. I told you I'm desperate. I want a meal on the table tomorrow night, the very best of your skill set. Consider it an audition, if you like. But I will say this. You're on borrowed time, Miss French. By all rights, I ought to toss you right out the door. The only reason I'm not is because of that stack cake. It was good enough to make the men forget all about the beef disaster. She bit the inside of her cheek to keep from smiling as relief flooded her. Do you understand I'm giving you one more chance? Yes, I do. Good, he retorted, because if we have a repeat of tonight, I'll post that skill set to your next employer and make sure cooking isn't on it. He stalked towards the door and paused, his hand on the handle as he glanced back at her. You can make another one of those cakes too. Without another word, he left the kitchen. Amelia smiled at the apple cores sitting in the bucket near the door, waiting to go out to the chickens. She'd whipped up dessert on a whim once she'd found those apples in the cellar, knowing the delicious taste of them in combination with molasses and cinnamon would be just the thing to close out her first day here on the ranch. Thank you for teaching me that one, Papa, she whispered, knowing that her father's favorite cake had saved her bacon, for tonight, at least. Chapter 6. Anything else? Amelia chewed her lip as she looked over her list. It wasn't the list of skills to get a placement in a new household, but rather a list of items that would hopefully help keep her employed at the Whitman Ranch. Yes, I believe that's everything. Oh, and could you do an extra pound of flour, please? The man behind the counter, who'd introduced himself as Mr. Gordon, nodded pleasantly. Of course, miss. If you'd like to give me 10 minutes or so, I'll just put all of this together for you. Thank you. Amelia roamed through the general store while she waited, reflecting once again on how different everything was here. Nestled within the emerald embrace of the Laramie Mountains, the town of Sheridan unfolded like a page from a beloved, well-read book. The heart of the town was undoubtedly its train station. Already this morning, Amelia had heard the steam whistle cries of arriving trains echoing through the town. The swing station close by was bustling with stagecoaches with their drivers, battered wagons, and weary travelers, their sun-beaten faces carrying stories of thrilling encounters and narrow escapes. The town's main thoroughfare was lined with establishments flaunting wooden facades and broad awnings, providing much-needed respite from the blazing summer sun. The lively saloons were filled with the clinking of glassware, piano tunes, and laughter, while the general stores boasted shelves teeming with goods from across the country, a cornucopia of the town's prosperity. Opposite, the mercantile, a treasure trove of goods from far and wide, flourished with the trade of settlers, miners, and cowboys. Dry goods, farming implements, and sweet-smelling jars of penny candy were among the wares on offer. It seemed to her that dusty cowboys and grizzled miners rubbed shoulders with gaily dressed ladies, their sunbonnets casting a flirtatious shadow over rosy cheeks. Children darted between buckboards and buggies, their laughter ringing out like the purest music. Beyond the town, expanses of lush fields unrolled, dotted with groves of picken trees and serene fishing ponds, their mirror-like surfaces capturing the ever-changing Wyoming sky. Small houses feathered the edges of the town, marked by fences. Flowering dogwoods and crimson azaleas painted the town with splashes of color. She could get used to it, she knew, but she needed a chance to stay here long enough to hone her cooking skills. Her next dessert might not be enough to save her. She paused to run her hand over a bolt of calico, studying the tiny flowers printed on the fabric. Amelia had left her finer dresses behind, but she'd brought several that had served her well in the bakery and that she'd decided would also be suitable for a cook on a ranch. Eventually, however, she'd need to replace them. "Oh, that yellow would look just lovely on you." Surprised, Amelia turned to the side to see a woman just a few years younger than her. Her black ringlets were captured expertly under a smart little hat, and her deep brown eyes were warm and friendly. "Do you think so?" "Yes, certainly." The young woman picked up the bolt, unrolled a bit of the fabric, and held it up under Amelia's chin. "The yellow would look wonderful against your red hair, and there's just enough green in these tiny little leaves to complement your eyes." Though Amelia had never met this woman before, she was already taking a quick liking to her. "You sound as though you know your fabrics." "I suppose I have to since I work with them all the time. My name is Sue Lynch." "Amelia French." Amelia responded to the introduction. Sue continued, "I'm the maid at Mayor Sullivan's home, once Mrs. Prosody. Sullivan found out that I could sew. However, I've spent more time with a needle in my hand than a feather duster." Sue held her hand to her mouth and giggled. "Mrs. Sullivan," Amelia mused, "that's not the woman I just saw down the street, is it? With the dark blue dress that all of her friends were admiring?" The woman had looked positively elegant, far more than Amelia had suspected out here in Wyoming. Sue nodded enthusiastically. "She certainly is. She loves dark blue. It makes her eyes shine, and her husband compliments her on it all the time. Oh, but look at me telling tales. You really should get yourself the yellow calico." Amelia swallowed. It was beautiful fabric, but it was bound to look a bit worse after she got a hold of it. "I'm afraid my skills are more based around an oven than behind a needle. I can bake just about anything you like, but I don't think I'd do this lovely material any justice." "A baker, hmm?" Sue's cheeks dimpled as she smiled. "Then you and I should work out a nice little trade. I'd be much happier whipping up a new dress for you than I would be baking bread for the week." Amelia could do loaves of bread with her eyes closed. She couldn't imagine a better deal. There was just one problem. "I'd love to do it, but I ought to wait and make sure that I'll be staying in Sheridan for a while. I'm on a trial basis at the moment with my new boss, Mr. Whitman." There was no need for Sue to know just how badly she'd failed at that first meal. Her new friend's eyes went wide. Matthew Whitman? Oh, that poor soul. Poor soul? Amelia hadn't known Mr. Whitman very long, but he hardly seemed like anyone to feel sorry for. He had expansive land, a sizable home, and a thriving ranch. The only thing that lacked was his awful attitude most of the time. With a glance over her shoulder, Sue took Amelia by the elbow and led her outside. The day was bright and sunny, but the breeze kept it from being too warm. "I suppose you're new in town and you haven't heard what happened to him." "No, I can't say that I have." "You see, Mr. Whitman and his wife Jane moved here several years ago. The whole town was flourishing and their ranch was doing well, but then influenza hit. It took Jane as well as their son. The poor man was devastated. If it weren't for his chief ranch hand stepping up and taking care of the whole place, I don't imagine he'd still have a penny left to his name. Sure, it's left him a bit of a grouchy man, but who could blame him? I'd say I'd be rather angry at the world, too, if I'd had to go through such a plight." Amelia could hardly believe what she was hearing. "I had no idea." Sue shook her head. "There I am, telling tales again. Perhaps I shouldn't have told you if he hadn't bothered to tell you himself. But it seems only right that you should know if you're working for the man. I understand he's fair with the men who work for him, and he's well respected around here. It's just that he's gone a little sour." She lifted her shoulders and scrunched her face. "I do appreciate it," Amelia assured her. "Perhaps I can stop in and speak with you sometime about the dress." "Yes," Sue instantly brightened. "I'm not hard to find. It's the blue house just a bit further down the way. Mrs. Sullivan was the one who chose the color, if you can guess," she said with a wink. Before long, Mr. Gordon had everything ready, and his son was loading it into the back of the cart that Amelia had taken into town. Amelia wished she had more time to spend with Sue, but hopefully she'd see her again sometime soon. As she drove back toward Whitman Ranch, she thought about Matthew. There certainly had been a couple of times when he'd shown his rougher side and made her wish she'd never come to Wyoming. and yet he'd apologized to her when he'd insulted her, and he gave her a second chance despite the poor job she'd done. Either he was completely desperate for a cook, or he did have a softer side underneath that grouchy, handsome exterior. Chapter 7. Don't mind me. I'm just in here to get the matches. That big rain left quite the chill, which surprises me this time of year. Matthew Whitman may be asking her not to mind, but Amelia couldn't ignore his heavy footfalls on the kitchen floor behind her as she bent over to dip up a spoonful of the chicken soup she'd been making all day. She quickly straightened up. I guess I'm not the only one who thought it was unseasonably cold then. This soup should warm everyone up quickly. He paused and took a cautious sniff at the pot. It doesn't smell bad. That's not much of a compliment, but I'll take it. Amelia tasted the broth and let it roll around on her tongue. She'd discussed some of her dilemmas when she'd had a chance to visit with Sue again. The maid was an excellent seamstress, but it turned out she had more kitchen skills than she liked to brag about. She'd sent Amelia home with some recipes as well as the advice to taste her creations often. Sue assured her that as she started experimenting with various herbs, she'd start to learn how to make the flavors she wanted. Needs more garlic. And what about all of this? Amelia looked over her shoulder to see him looking down at the kitchen table, where just about every bowl and pot in the Whitman kitchen that she hadn't already been using for the chicken soup was delicately covered in a thin towel. I'm baking. Do we need that much bread? I mean, I like the bread you make, so do the men, and if your soup turns out all right, then it'll taste wonderful with it. But why so much? Her cheeks pinkened slightly. She and Mr. Whitman had been getting along well enough, but they hadn't talked about anything personal. A friend and I are working out a trade. I'm baking some bread for her household, and she's making me a new dress. To her surprise, he gave a nod of approval. Very efficient of you. Amelia turned to the cutting board to prepare the garlic. Honestly, that was the biggest lesson my father always sought to teach us when it came to running the bakery. It was about having good recipes and a good feel for what to do with various kinds of doughs and crusts. Yes, but it was also about efficiency. You never stand around waiting for your dough to rise when there's something else you can be doing. Those are pretty wise words. In a way, a ranch isn't much different. If your cattle are happy in their current pasture, you have to spend that time mending fences or patching the roof of the barn. You can't stand around waiting for the cows to drop their calves. Mr. Whitman picked up the corner of a towel and peeked underneath it. You'll make it fall, she warned as she dropped the garlic into the soup pot. He immediately dropped the cloth. Sorry, I'm just kidding. Starting to feel a little more comfortable, Amelia came over to the table and took a peek under the cloth herself. It looked good and had nearly doubled in size. When she poked a finger into it and the dents didn't fill back in, she knew for sure. This one will be ready in time for dinner. She could feel his eyes on her as she opened the drawer for the baking pans. You seem to be getting used to feeding so many people. Amelia pressed her lips together, knowing he was talking about the stew that hadn't gone as far as she'd hoped. This time, however, she'd filled the biggest pot with the chicken soup, adding in plenty of vegetables to make it hearty. The batch of dough she was working with right now would make 2 full trays of rolls, more than enough for each of the men. I guess when I got here, I'd forgotten that other important part of what my father had told me. Always make more than you think you're going to need. He just gets smarter and smarter the more you talk about him. You must miss him. Yes. Amelia carefully arranged the rolls on the trays, leaving just enough room for the second round of rising. He passed away just over a year ago. It was rather sudden, and I'm afraid things have changed a lot since then. His brows drew together. I know how that can be. Her breath caught in her throat as she decided what she should say next. Should she tell him that she'd heard about his family? Or would that be rude? Admittedly, knowing what she did about his history had helped her to forgive some of his faults, but so had the fact that they'd been getting along so well ever since then. She didn't want to ruin that by opening old wounds. The front door slammed, making them both jump. Hey, boss, Boys are on their way in. Be right out. Arlie, I've got to get that fire lit. Matthew picked up the matches he'd come for and stepped out into the dining room. When the rolls were finished and she was satisfied with the soup, Amelia felt far surer of herself in serving this meal. She'd made some mistakes, yes, but she liked to think many of them were behind her. Seeing their eager faces as she exited the kitchen made her feel that much better about what she was doing here. Maybe these men weren't so difficult to please as long as they had warm food in their bellies. That smells amazing, Miss French, Arlie said as she ladled a bowl and put it in front of him. I don't think I've ever been this excited for chicken soup. It's the perfect day for it, she said with a smile, with a nod toward the window and the gray, misty clouds that cloaked the mountains. Amelia had always liked her work in the bakery, but she was starting to think it might be even more satisfying working here. She was the one in charge, at least of the kitchen. The ranch hands had intimidated her a bit at first, but she could see now that they weren't anything more than overgrown boys who still needed comfort and care. I can feel that warmth right down to my toes, Michael said as he swallowed his first bite. That's all well and good, but did you try the bread? Another hand, Joel, eagerly slathered butter on half a roll. It's so soft. Amelia couldn't stop smiling to herself as she made trips back and forth between the kitchen and the dining room, ensuring that everyone had all he needed. She could feel Mr. Whitman's eyes on her, but she concentrated on the warm feel of the fire and the delicious smell of the soup instead. When the men had pushed back their chairs and the basket of rolls was no longer being depleted, Amelia began cleaning up. Does anyone need anything else? There's plenty more where this came from. Caleb, a young man who'd come over from a neighboring ranch to help while one of the hands had gone to visit his ill sister, looked up at her with shining eyes. Miss, I only wish that I could. That was the most remarkable meal that I've ever had. His open appreciation for her made her blush. Thank you very much, Caleb. I really do mean it, he insisted. I don't think I'll even want to go back to work over at the Price place. All right, Caleb. I think she gets the point, Mr. Whitman said, clearing his throat. Thank you for the meal, Miss French. She finally allowed herself to meet his gaze. The fire and the soup were warm and comforting, but the fond look in his eyes was far more tempting. Any words of acknowledgement got stuck in her throat, and so with a simple nod, she returned to the safety of the kitchen. There, she set the bowls in the sink and prepared to wash up. The rain was still drizzling down outside the window and thumping gently on the roof. Amelia tried to tell herself that the jolts of excitement she felt in her chest were simply the satisfaction of a job well done, but she knew it wasn't true. Mr. Whitman was a handsome man, and though he could come across as gruff, she was truly seeing that there was more to him. Gritting her teeth together and concentrating on the dishes, Amelia reminded herself that he was her boss. She was here to work and nothing more. Chapter 8. Matthew headed in from the pasture. They'd had several rainy days which had left the ranch muddy and miserable. The sun had returned and dried up the mud, making his work far easier. He was grateful for it, but he felt a knot of apprehension in his stomach as he left his horse at the fence and walked up toward the house. It was his home, a place he'd built with his own two hands and a bit of help from the neighbors. It was a place where he'd known complete happiness, utter sadness, and everything in between. He could navigate every corner with his eyes shut if he had to, so there was no reason for him to feel strange about walking up the porch steps and opening the front door. The kitchen door was just to his right, and he hesitated as he studied the paneling on it. That was Miss French's domain now. It didn't mean he wasn't allowed, but it didn't feel the same way it used to. He dropped his hat on the hook and swiped a hand through his hair, knowing that in many ways that difference was only good. Not so long ago, it had been up to him to try and feed the fellas. His poor culinary skills, or the cooking of another unlucky cowpoke selected on that day, had been bad. How come his men had ended up at the saloons, making trouble for themselves? That, coupled with keeping up with the jobs and the general paperwork, meant that the ranch had been neglected. Miss French, though she'd struggled a bit at first, now ran that end of the house with alacrity. She insisted on only the best supplies and ingredients, even when it meant that Mr. Gordon down at the general store had to do special orders. Matthew had been skeptical of this, but the remarkable things she was able to produce with those ingredients had made him sign off on the orders without even a glance. He stood frozen, just inside the door, trying to decide what to do. He didn't want to disturb Amelia at her work, and he didn't truly need anything in there. But still, the need to see her was like an itch that he simply had to scratch. He pushed the door open, telling himself that this was his house after all. Something simmered on the stove. Another covered bowl on the table suggested that there would be some more of her delectable bread rolls to go with their nightly meal. The drapes had been opened wide to let the sunshine in on the sparkling clean sink. There was no sign of Amelia. Miss French? Not finding her there, he stepped out into the living room and called up the stairs. Miss French? There was still no reply. Perhaps she'd gone upstairs to rest for a while. Matthew knew, though, that she'd never done that on any other day. If she were sick, then she might need the doctor. He thundered up the stairs. Amelia, are you all right? After several knocks on her door, as beads of sweat were starting to stand out at his temples, he went ahead and opened it. Her bed was neatly made, but she wasn't in it. Where could she have gone? Just as he was about to leave, he spotted movement through her window. Matthew could just see where the driveway curved at the end. The yellow fluttering of fabric told him that Miss French was down at the end of the road, wearing that new dress she'd recently received from the mayor's maid. She wasn't alone either. Matthew frowned as he watched. His cook was chatting with Caleb, the man who'd come over from the Price's ranch to help them for a bit. He held out a bundle of flowers for her, and Miss French took the posy with a smile. The wind kicked up, and she laughed as she reached up to hold her bonnet on her head. The road was just far enough away that Matthew couldn't see much more detail than that, but he swore he could see the shining joy in each of their eyes. Tent. The heavy feeling that overcame him was something he hadn't felt in a long time. It was the sort of feeling he'd had as a very young man when Jane... Well, no. He'd just been out in the sun too much. Whatever Caleb and Miss French were chatting about was their business, and it didn't have anything to do with him. Completely forgetting why he'd even come into the house in the first place, Matthew headed back out to the barn. He needed work to distract him, and there was always plenty of it around here. He'd be back to rights in short order. I think she's made all the difference, to be honest with you. Fletcher's voice carried around the corner of the barn. I wasn't so sure I wanted to stay here, but I sure do now. Same here. I don't even get meals like that at my mother's house. I can't say that I mind looking at her either. Did you see her in that yellow dress? The new one? This was Michael's voice. Matthew paused, his fists curling at his sides. It didn't matter to him. Miss French was a pretty young woman, and it was no surprise that his employees would be interested in her. What did he care? Fletcher let out a low whistle. She's hard to miss in that. The dress is her made-over in fabric, all bright and happy, but so pretty. She knew what she was doing when she picked that out. That was more than he could handle. Matthew stormed around the corner of the barn to see Michael and Fletcher in the shade of the building, taking a break with a jug of cool water from the well. Just what do you think Miss French would say if she could hear you talking about her like that? Michael flushed all the way to his ears. We didn't mean anything by it, boss. We were just talking. Fletcher nodded. She's a great cook, and she's awful pretty. You understand, don't you? Anger and frustration flooded him, even though Fletcher was right. She's here to do a job. She's not here for your entertainment. I suggest you both start acting like gentlemen if we're going to keep her around. He stomped off, furious that the sun should shine so brightly when he felt so stormy inside. To make matters even worse, he spotted Miss French coming back up the driveway toward the house. The winds caught at the edges of her skirt, making the colorful fabric billow and swirl, the tendrils of her hair framing her heart-shaped face. The bundle of flowers was cradled in her arms, and she smiled when she saw him. Michael and Fletcher were right. She was enough to make a man's mouth water. Hello, Mr. Whitman. Irritation overrode all other emotions. Where have you been? I was looking all over for you, and then I spot you all the way down by the road, flirting with Caleb." He saw the impact his words had when she stopped, her eyes shadowing with upset. It was the same look she'd had the day they'd met when he'd accused her of trying to trick one of his ranch hands into marrying her. Testiness chased the anguish, and her eyes flashed. He'd ticked her off, and he wasn't sorry about it. "I beg your pardon? I don't pay you to trip about the state with your boyfriends and beaux, Miss French." Her mouth dropped open, and her cheeks colored with anger. "Actually, Mr. Whitman," she tugged free a small paper packet from the crook of her arm. "I'd visited with Mrs. Hart, your neighbor. She'd kindly offered herbs so that I might try them in my stew before I went to the expense of buying them, which, in my book, is still working." Her finger shot up the heavens when he opened his mouth, cutting him off. Pro 7%. "Furthermore, my cooking is up to date, and I took my time walking back so that I might enjoy the weather for a few minutes, instead of being stuck in the kitchen from dawn till dusk, as I have been all week." "I saw your dalliance with Caleb, Amelia," he ground out. "You looked like you were doing a lot more than walking with him. On my time, you work for me, and I have very strict rules about the way my staff should behave themselves." "Mr. Whitman, I truly do not like what you are implying here. Nothing I did was so wrong." Matthew gestured at the flowers in her arms. "Do you want me to have to explain it to you?" She drew herself up to her full height, which still fell woefully under his chin. "I think you'd better, because I certainly don't understand. I was walking back here, and Caleb happened to be coming down the road. He was on his way here to thank me for the meals he'd had while he was working here, and he did so with the kind gesture of these flowers. That's far more than anyone else has done, and I thought it was very sweet and kind of him, but that's all it was." The breeze made the yellow fabric of her dress flutter around her ankles. The square neckline was modest, right at her collarbone. The sleeves ended in ruffles right at her elbows. Somehow, the entire garment seemed to be about movement and brightness, sunshine and home. He dragged his errant mind and tried to hold on to the anger. It was easier than having to examine the feelings that pooled in his belly as she glared at him. She was magnificent most days, but today, with her eyes sparkling under the pretty bonnet and her cheeks all pinked up, well, she looked edible. He put his hands on his hips. "You're not from round here, Miss French. I can tell you for sure that Caleb's intentions were not as genial as you've taken them to be." He kept the bit about the comments the ranch hands made about her to himself. Her brow puckered. "You don't know that. You weren't there. Caleb is a sweet boy, Mr. Whitman. He was just showing his appreciation, and I'd thank you to keep your unsavory comments to yourself." Matthew pressed his thumb and finger to his forehead. "No man walks 2 miles down the road with flowers in his hand just to say thank you." "Then I suggest you go talk to him about it, not me." Crushing the flowers to her chest and lifting her chin, she brushed past him toward the house. He turned to follow her, unwilling to allow her to have the last word, but he stopped. Even when she was angry, even when she wasn't looking at him, she was a vision. Seeing her with the house in the background made it that much harder to stay angry with her. Miss French made him think about things he never imagined would come to be for him again. Things like having someone to while away the long evenings with, or little feet pattering on the hardwood floor. That thought stopped him in his tracks. He had no desire to go down that road ever again. That road led to pain and hurt. Deliberately, he turned his back to her, ignoring the curious eyes of the cowpokes who peered out of the bunkhouse and outhouses as he went back to work. Chapter 9. "There you go. Lots of tasty treats for you, ladies." Amelia tossed the bucket of kitchen scraps into the coop, happily watching as the hens rushed in to grab the best of the lettuce stems and tomato tops. While they were thoroughly distracted, she slipped into the hen house to collect the eggs. They would make all the difference in her meals, whether she was baking up something sweet or serving a simple breakfast of bacon and eggs. Mr. Whitman had hurt her with his insults, even more so than the time before. Amelia wanted to pretend otherwise as she gathered the warm eggs and tucked them into her apron. She wanted to pretend that it didn't matter and that he was just looking out for her. She was a single woman on her own, after all. Her feelings for her boss, however, made it so much more complicated. Matthew Whitman had even joined her in her dreams, his blue eyes twinkling as the susurrus of his sweet promises drifted on the winds of her mind. If only he knew how much she cared for him, she knew he would change his tone about what he believed had happened between her and Caleb. With her apron full, she stepped back out of the henhouse. She nudged back the brown bodies as she let herself out of the gate when the telltale line of dust rising off the driveway caught her eye. Amelia stopped to watch for a moment. It was too early in the day for the ranch hands to be at the bunkhouse, and Matthew hadn't mentioned he was expecting any visitors. Perhaps it was Mrs. Hart, though she would usually send a maid over with a note to check that a visit was permitted, such as was her way. She watched a while longer, her curiosity rising as the wagon turned into the drive. Mr. Whitman, Arlie, and the other men were all out in the pastures. She was the only one here, and so Amelia supposed it was her job to see what the visitor wanted. Whatever their business was, the speed with which they raced up the driveway suggested it was quite urgent. Her apron was full of eggs, but if there was some emergency, she didn't dare take the time to stop at the house first. She paused in the yard, waiting. Stunned realization dawned on her when the newcomer was close enough for her to see his face clearly. Nelson? The concentration on his face spoke volumes as he brought the horse to a stop. Stiffly, he leaned back and exhaled. He was breathing hard as if he'd been on horseback instead of the comfort of a wagon seat. Amelie took a step towards him, wariness edging out the pleasant surprise. "What are you doing here?" "Looking for you," he snapped, pulling off his hat and using the rag in his top pocket to swipe at his head. "I thought I'd never get here. Stop, you wretched beast." He gripped the front of the wagon as the horse began to move off again. Quickly, Amelia set the eggs into a plant pot and then hurried across the yard to grab the bridle as her brother continued to berate the poor creature. Amelia murmured gently and then led the horse to the barrel. The mare stuck her nose deep into the water and began drinking. "She's thirsty, Nelson. There's no need to scream and shout like that. You'll frighten her." "It's a her?" Typical woman, not listening. Amelia sent her brother a frustrated look. "Why don't you climb down from there before you pop a button?" Nelson's mouth pinched white, though he checked that she had a good grip on the bridle, and then he quickly scrambled down. He adjusted his clothing and dusted off his pants. "Why do you have a wagon?" "I had to buy one." Her frown deepened. "What?" "A man at Hollow Creek told me that the trains stopped there and that there wasn't another way of getting to Sheridan without paying someone to bring me here. He named an exorbitant fee to escort me, or I could buy this haggard wagon and save a fortune. Of course, I can simply sell it when I get back to Hollow Creek, get my money back, and be on my way back to civilization." Amelia stared at her brother as his tale unfolded. "Nelson, I hate to be the one to break bad news to you, but you've been duped." "What nonsense are you spouting, Amelia? What was I supposed to do, pay that swindler?" Amelia rubbed the mare's neck. She eyed the wagon carefully, then peeled back the mare's upper lip and sighed heavily. "Did the wagon drive okay?" "Well, the terrain here hardly makes for a smooth journey, and there was a terrible noise coming from the back, but the man assured me that it was because the ground here isn't the same as back east." "I'd say those wheels are held on by a wing and a prayer, Nelson. This mare is very old, and Sheridan is 2 stops further down the train track after Hollow Creek." Nelson's face darkened. "You're mistaken." She shook her head. "About which part?" He looked about the place, the grand house, the yard, the stables, and the bunkhouse. His pinched expression told her exactly what he thought about the place in which she'd chosen to make her home. "Why would that man lie?" "To make you part with your money, of course, but none of this explains what you are doing here in the first place." "Did you get my letter?" "The one you sent demanding that I return home immediately?" "Yes." She read it and promptly burned it. The supercilious tone had infuriated her. He'd done his best to ruin her confidence, reminding her where her duties to him lay. He wanted her back home, and that was that. He fisted his hands at his hands and glowered at her. I didn't get your response. That will be because I didn't write one, she replied, her attention switching when the horse tried to pull her towards the clumps of long grass that sprouted around the foot of the fence posts. She allowed the mare to reach the grassy edges and take a bite. Nelson followed her. Why did you not reply? Because I said all I wanted to say on the matter back home. I'm not prepared to marry just so I have a roof over my head. You don't want me in our family home. I made a choice. I chose my independence over your need to have my skills, but not my company. Not everything in this life goes your way, Nelson. Now you're just being pig-headed, he snapped. She found her tone matching his waspish one. You came all this way to insult me more to my face? Instead of more retaliation, Nelson seemed to deflate in front of her. This held her attention more than any cruel jibes he might have flung at her. Her heart clutched in her chest. What is it? There's no easy way to say this, Amelia. He took a deep breath and let it out with a shake of his head. The bakery is failing. It's hemorrhaging money. She blinked at him in confusion for a moment. Even in the leaner months, the bakery had always made a profit. She sensed he was being a little dramatic, but she asked, why? Nelson flung his hands in the air, startling the mare. That's precisely what I can't figure out. It's always thrived. From the moment Father opened the place, people were practically lined up to get the best loaves of bread and the freshest pies. All of a sudden, business seems to have just dried up. I can't for the life of me figure it out. When she'd left for Wyoming, Amelia hadn't even been sure she'd see her brother again, much less have him standing right here in front of her like this. She knew she ought to be glad, but something told her this couldn't be good. And if he was making similar business decisions, like buying a broken wagon and mare who wouldn't make it through the following winter, it stood to reason that the business wasn't being run as well as it should be. Still, she had to remind herself that she didn't own the business. Her father had left Nelson in charge, and Nelson had made it clear that she wasn't needed. Quite frankly, Nelson, I thought you were about to tell me that Mother had passed away. Things must be dire if you've made a visit in person, and I'm sorry that the bakery isn't doing well, but I hardly understand what I'm supposed to do about it from here. Her brother grinned, and she suspected she'd just answered her own question. That's just the thing. You can't. But you can grab your things and come back to Greenville with me. You can have your position at the bakery again, so you won't have to work on some grubby ranch in the back end of nowhere with nothing to do. The ranch wasn't grubby in the least, something she knew quite well since she was the one who kept it clean. I don't think it's that simple, Nelson. I'd still have to find a place to stay, which won't be easy for a woman on her own. He waved his hand through the air as though her concerns didn't matter. That's the thing. You can move right back into your old room at my house. But Blanche has come to her senses, Nelson said firmly before she could continue. She was just feeling a little territorial, what with being a new wife and all. She's very sorry for being so cold to you, and she and I would both be very happy to have you under our roof again. This was all so much, and in too short of a time. She focused on the mare where she happily grazed on the thick blades of grass, the rhythmic crunching strangely comforting. I don't know. I want to help you, Nelson. You're family, and it's not lost on me just how important that is. But I've come to love my job here. I'm needed here. You're needed back home where you belong, Nelson whined. I'm your brother, Amelia. Baking is in your blood. She felt her resolve wavering, all that she knew, home comforts and convenience of being back in a city. Come on, Amelia. It can't be that great here, can it? Amelia frowned. Most of the time it was, yes. She stayed busy, and the work was pleasant. She had time both to be alone and to be with others. Sue had become a good friend, and she'd included her in the sewing group, which had allowed her to make more local connections. She had grown attached to the ranch, the town, and the people. Even to Matthew, as maddening and grouchy as he was. There were times when he'd shown her kindness, almost a tenderness. She'd caught him looking at her on occasions, a deep and thoughtful frown threading through his dark brows. He must have sensed her resolve wavering, and so he pressed on, knowing the right guilt buttons to press with her. Papa worked so hard for that bakery, Amelia. His legacy shouldn't be a business with closed doors. It would kill him to think that his children wouldn't work to keep the business thriving. He'd want you to help me, wouldn't he? Even Mother thinks so. Nelson, you sent me away. I didn't. Having you leave me has hurt me beyond measure, Amelia. I tried to keep Blanche happy, as any good husband would do for his new wife. Please, I need you to come back and help me work out what's going wrong. I can't do this without you. The whining, needling tone hit the spot. Movement behind Nelson's shoulder drew her attention. She spotted the riders as they made their way out of the pasture gate. Prosody had been out to the furthest edges of the ranch today, and she guessed they'd been checking the fences. Matthew's face was shadowed under the wide brim of his hat, but she could see the rigid set of his jaw as he approached them. Miss French? Nelson whirled at the voice. He guffawed at the weathered faces, with their leather clothing and neckerchiefs. He sent a mocking look at his sister, though she quelled any comment with a headshake. Matthew swung out of his saddle and tossed the reins to Arlie with an order to go back to the bunkhouse, though the chief ranch hand didn't move. None of the men did. His gaze raked her face. She wondered if he could sense her distress. "What's wrong?" Amelia cleared her throat. "Mr. Whitman, this is my brother, Nelson French. Nelson, this is Matthew Whitman. He owns the ranch." Matthew's shoulders instantly relaxed and he reached out to shake Nelson's hand. "It's nice to meet you." Miss French didn't mention that she was expecting any visitors. Nelson easily returned the greeting. "She wasn't, and I'm sorry for the inconvenience, but I'm afraid Amelia will be coming back to North Carolina with me." Her mouth fell open as she stared at her brother. Matthew was the first of them both to recover. He looked sharply at her. "You're doing what?" "Nelson, Yes, it's high time my sister returned to the comforts of the real world. I'm aware that she will be losing her position here, but I'm certain that you won't have much trouble replacing her cooking skills, especially considering the customers." Nelson encompassed the ranch hands with a sweep of his hand. It was Amelia's turn to glare at Nelson, but again Matthew interrupted. "Now, you just wait just a darn minute. I don't give a hoot who you are. You're on my land, and you won't insult hard-working men. They'll hardly have discerning tastes when it comes to cuisine, will they?" Nelson shook his head pityingly. "Nelson, that's enough." Amelia found her voice. "I haven't agreed to." "What's that supposed to mean?" Matthew demanded, anger shimmering around him as he glared at her brother. "Please, will you both just calm down?" she tried. "Oh, I'm sorry. Shall I use smaller words for you, Whitman?" Nelson sniggered. "Look, I'm prepared to compensate you." Nelson reached into his coat pocket and drew out a pocketbook. "I'd say a month's wages ought to cover it. Less expenses for her trip home, of course." Matthew took a step towards her brother, his eyes lighting like blue flames. Amelia dropped the reins to put herself in between them both. "Enough," she shouted. "Both of you, stop it, this instant." "The girl's right," Arlie said. His gravelly voice was like ice on the fiery tempers. He picked up the mare's reins and held them out with his left hand, his eyes not moving from the three of them. "Fletch, come take this old mare. The rest of you into the bunkhouse. Go bed down your horses and wash up ready for supper. Move, now." Wordlessly, the group did as their boss instructed, leaving the four of them alone. Amelia risked a look at Matthew, who was watching her carefully. Eyes shuttered. She looked away, her chest squeezing painfully. "I don't understand much about the world, but it seems to me that the two stallions are making decisions without checking what the filly has to say about it all. Maybe you should start by asking her." Then Arlie lifted his hat to Amelia, which drew the edges of her mouth up a sad smile as he ambled across the yard. "Well?" Matthew asked tightly. Amelia looked at him again. A muscle ticked in his jaw, and his knuckles were white where they were bald at his sides. Nelson stepped forward so that he was right in front of Amelia, blocking her line of sight from Matthew. "Amelia, sister, our father started the bakery with his own two hands, building it from the ground up. If you don't come home, it might not stay open much longer." Amelia felt as though the next breeze could blow her over. She felt the deep pull of the family obligation, requiring her to do whatever was necessary to ensure the rest of her family was cared for. but she had a responsibility out here on the ranch as well. What would Fletcher, Michael, Arlie, and the rest of them do without her? She'd heard all about the stories of them going to town and being rowdy. For two of them, another arrest could mean jail time. The ranch hadn't had one single visit from the sheriff since she'd arrived, a fact that the men laid squarely at her feet. Didn't that mean something? Please, I need you. I need you to come home. I messed up, Amelia. Father would want you to do this. Amelia's shoulders sagged. He was right. The bakery had put clothes on their back and a roof over their heads for their whole lives. It had given them a far better life than any of them had ever imagined. Just because her father had passed away, it didn't mean she shouldn't still be grateful. Fine, I'll go. I need some time to pack my things. No. The voice behind Nelson was quiet, but she could hear the determination behind it. Miss French, you're not going. I won't allow it. Now, see here. Nelson whirled on Mr. Whitman, stepping close and stabbing a finger into his chest. I'm her brother. You don't have any say in this. It's not very brotherly to manipulate her like that, Matthew growled. Amelia quickly stepped around Nelson, placing herself in between them again. Misery crushed her when she looked at Matthew. Leaving would mean that she wouldn't see him every day, and she knew that that was the biggest factor in what was holding her here. This grouchy, cantankerous rancher had a soft center that he protected. She'd seen glimpses of it, and she found it fascinating. Right now, though, she saw only the hardened exterior. She implored him with her eyes. It's family, Mr. Whitman. I must see to the business and help my brother. Amelia, Matthew began. Hearing her name on her lips turned her insides to liquid gold and her breath catch. You don't have to go if you don't want to. I'd be happy to escort him and that ramshackle cart off my property. Just say the word. There's a place here for you. Father would want you to do this. Nelson was right. Her father would expect her to give her undivided attention to the bakery, to figure out what was wrong with it. The pull of duty was deeply rooted in her. Amelia rolled her lips, fighting off the need to cry as she whispered, I'm sorry, Mr. Whitman, but I have to go. Chapter 10. Matthew took a moment. Beyond the door he stood in front of, he could hear the rumble of voices. His ranch hands sitting patiently, waiting for their supper. They no longer stomped into the house, cursing and shoving at each other. Any banter amongst them was tempered, and their language was much less offensive than what they used on the range. Not that 10 men were particularly quiet when they sat in the same room, eager for a meal, but it was a far cry from the rowdy crowd they used to be. Matthew pushed the door open, his icy gaze sweeping the room. The men looked up expectantly, though a few frowned when it was Matthew in the doorway and not Amelia. They didn't lean back in their chairs or put their elbows on the table. Arlie had combed his beard. Michael's shirts had been missing buttons at one time, but he must have asked Amelia to sew them all back on. Nobody, not even Fletcher, had been causing trouble in town for weeks. Whilst all this was nice, he had to remind himself that the success of his cattle ranch didn't rely on combed beards and polite dinner conversation. Arlie was the first to notice him. His roomy gaze moved to the empty space behind him and then skewered him to the spot. Dinner isn't coming, is it? Matthew cleared his throat. Actually, she had made a pot pie. I'll fetch it through shortly, but it will be the last meal that she makes for us. She left with her brother about a half hour ago. She's heading back to North Carolina. A murmur of alarm went around the table. In that rickety wagon? Fletcher asked. She won't make it past the end of the drive in that, mumbled another. I can't believe she abandoned us. Are we sure that he was her brother? They looked nothing alike. Matthew held out his hands. It was her brother, and she wasn't given a whole lot of choice in the matter. We haven't known her all that long, but she doesn't seem like the sort who'd just up and leave without any notice. That's right, Fletcher agreed. She didn't even say goodbye, and she's too polite for that. Matthew sighed. He'd hoped to simply tell them she was gone, then promise to hire someone else for them and be done with it. Clearly, they weren't going to settle down until they got the whole story. She didn't have a chance to say goodbye, Fletcher. Her brother showed up, demanding that she return home to help with their family bakery. It hasn't done very well since she left. I imagine not, Joel retorted. Nobody can bake like she does. Regardless, Matthew forged on, she said she had to go. She sent him to wait at the end of the driveway, then packed up her things. She didn't look back as she walked down the driveway. He hadn't meant to admit the last part out loud. How he'd stared at her retreating back, willing her to change her mind, having to restrain himself from chasing her down the driveway and hauling her across his saddle, much the same as he had the first day they'd met. He longed to beat that snooty city toad to a pulp, too. He rubbed his neck, hoping that his sun-beaten face wouldn't heat too much as he pushed down on the temper that bubbled within. The table fell silent for a long moment. You shouldn't have let her go, Fletcher finally said. And just what was I supposed to do? Matthew challenged. Shackle her to the stove. He couldn't even begin to describe the resentment that raged inside him. How could she just walk away from him like that? That's not what Fletch meant, Joel added quietly, then jolted when Fletcher kicked him under the table. Ow! What did he mean? Nothing. Fletcher's face was scarlet. I meant nothing by it. Joel rubbed his leg, scowling at his friend. Matthew's eyes moved around the rest of the group. Each of them was looking anywhere but at him. These were the men he sweated and grafted side by side every day. Most of them he'd lived alongside for more than a decade. He trusted each and every one of them. He folded his arms and cocked a hip, his gaze settling on Arlie. At least he could be relied on to give it to him straight. Come on, out with it. Arlie's fingers had been tapping on the tabletop. They stilled when all eyes turned to him. The old man pursed his lips as if debating his words carefully. Seems to me that Amelia has a strong sense of doing what's right, even if it's not right for her. Matthew frowned. What does that mean? You weren't very nice to her, Michael said quietly, staring down at his hands on the table. You were always grumpy with her. I mean, I know she made a few mistakes, but no one died. John chuckled. The food wasn't all that bad. I've eaten worse. Their words made his insides churn, and he realized the discomfort was from hearing the truth. We all heard you telling her off when Caleb gave her those flowers, Fletcher said. It wasn't her fault that Caleb was sweet on her, and now he doesn't work here because you told him there was no work, even though you were saying this morning how you wished there were more hours in the day. Matthew cut himself off, beyond frustrated now. I had good reason to get on to her. She was my employee, just as all of you are. I have a right to make sure my ranch is run the way I want it run. She did everything you asked of her, and more, Arlie added. None of that has anything to do with her leaving, Matthew insisted. She had family obligations that she had to attend to. That's all. There's nothing anyone could do to help that. I just have one question, Arlie said slowly. Did she want to go? Matthew wasn't certain he knew the answer to that. He'd seen her hesitation when Nelson had insisted. Short of scooping her up in his arms and knocking out the sanctimonious Nelson, he thought he'd done all that he could. And yet, he'd kept his mouth shut. He could have begged her to stay, told her how much he'd begun to enjoy their morning conversations when it had just been the two of them in the kitchen, enjoying the peace of the farm before the ranch hands had joined them for breakfast. How seeing her smile had become part of his daily routine. Heck, he'd even started to look forward to it on his ride back to the ranch house. Something that hadn't happened to him in so long, he'd believed his heart had turned to stone. Even more so, he wanted to think that she wanted to stay for him. But she'd left, and there was nothing he could do to change that now. He met Arlie's steady gaze and replied honestly, I don't know. Fletcher sighed. I was saving up an awful lot of my wages over the last couple of months, not going into town for supper and all. Guess it's time to go blow it all now because I'm sure not going to be starving on top of this bad news. Anyone else going? A rumble of agreements rolled around the room. The rest of the men got up and shuffled out. Only Arlie remained, and the chief ranch hand waited until they were alone before he spoke again. You know, the train for Des Moines won't leave until tomorrow. That means they'll have to stay on Sheridan overnight. So? Arlie cocked his head in disbelief. Matthew, I've known you a long time. You're one of the cleverest men I ever met, but sometimes you can be thicker than this table right here. Arlie tapped the surface. I'm not in the mood for insults. Can you make your point? My point is this. That girl has brought a whole heap of goodness to your door. Those boys have cleaned up. They're going to church again. Even you are keeping your stubble to a minimum, just the way your mama raised you to do. The last time I saw you this way was when you were interested in Jane. Matthew's brows dropped. Watch it, Arlie. The old man lifted a shoulder. I don't suppose you want me to sugarcoat anything now, do you? I know where this is going and you're barking up the wrong tree. She's an employee, nothing more. Arlie chuckled dryly. And I'm a monkey's uncle, Matthew Whitman. You're sweet on that girl. Why else would you strut around her when that young colt Caleb brought the girl flowers? No harm in flowers, yet you acted like he'd proposed to her. You snap and snarl at her, hold her at a distance, then stare after her like a lovesick puppy when she walks away from you. Matthew scrubbed at his face. You're wrong. I'm not, but you keep telling yourself that if it helps you sleep better at night. You've been different since she got here when you thought people weren't paying attention. Matthew opened his mouth to think of something to throw Arlie off the scent, but his mouth snapped shut when the knowing smile slid across the old man's face. Hat in hand again? Arlie shrugged. Always worth a try. Matthew could hear the muffled sounds of his ranch hands as they gathered in the yard. A glance told him that they'd harnessed up one of the horses who'd been resting that day. He could only hope that he wasn't called upon later on by Sheriff Hale. Arlie's chair scraped noisily along the wooden floor. He hitched up his pants and then picked up his hat. Best I go keep those fellas in line. There's food here for them. They don't have to go to the saloon. Way I see it, they're probably just wanting to make sure that our Miss French isn't in a ditch somewhere because the wheel fell off that old heap of a cart her brother had. Arlie settled his hat on his head. Matthew listened to the fading boot steps. He heard the muted laughter and calls as Arlie made his way out into the yard. Matthew went back into the kitchen. Everything was just as Amelia had left it, waiting for her as though she'd be coming right back. The pot pie scented the air of the kitchen. Golden-crusted bread rolls sat on the platter, waiting to be served. Fresh ingredients stocked the pantry, and all of the shelves were bulging with various pickles and powders. Amelia had brought the kitchen back to life and made it hers. He needed to be somewhere where he wasn't reminded of her, try and get his thoughts straight. As he went out into the rest of the house, however, he started to realize that it was impossible. The formerly dusty floors in the living room were now shining and clean, all because of her. The curtains that had gone ratty over the window were now replaced with pale blue gingham. Matthew knew she'd likely traded with her friend Sue for these, but it was still because of her. He didn't even dare go upstairs, where her bedroom door would remind him that she used to sleep under his roof. With nothing for him left in the house, Matthew went outside. The last rays of the sun were shooting up their brilliant colors on the horizon, illuminating the hilly pastures that were just as green as her eyes. He turned his gaze downward, searing for something, anything. That was when he noticed that the flower bed near the porch had been cleared of all the overgrown weeds, leaving stalks of yellow flowers to dance in the night air. Leaning heavily on the porch railing, Matthew sighed. He'd thought a cook was the final piece he needed to make his ranch the success he wanted it to be. He hadn't been entirely wrong with that. He needed someone to ensure his men were fed. But Miss French, Amelia, had done so much more than that. She'd brought this entire place together, using the smart business skills she'd learned from her father. Nothing went to waste around here, not even time. His men worked harder and better because they wanted to impress her. She was integral to the ranch at this point, and it needed her back. No, he said softly to himself, knowing that he could no longer lie to himself about the feelings he had for her. I need her back. Chapter 11. Amelia stood at the window of her little room at the inn. She looked out over the town that she'd come to love as her own in just the last few months. There was the general store, where Mr. Gordon had been so kind and patient with her as she'd made so many special requests. She spotted old Mrs. Tucker, a woman who had little family left and who liked to stop and chat with just about anyone on the street who would take the time. If she pressed her forehead to the glass and looked to the left, she could just see a bit of the bright blue house that belonged to the mayor. Of course, that made Amelia think of Sue. The maid had become a wonderful friend, someone Amelia thought she might be able to confide in and truly trust. Even now, Amelia was wearing one of the beautiful dresses Sue had made for her. She'd wear it on the train ride back to Greenville as her way of remembering the time that she'd had here. She turned at the knock on the door. "Come in." Nelson opened the door and stepped inside her room. He eyed her pretty dress, but kept any snide comments to himself. He bent down for the valise that she'd set by the door. "Ready? I suppose?" Amelia followed him downstairs and out onto the street. Her feet and her heart were heavy, and she forced herself to drag them along. "Why are you so sour?" Nelson asked as they made the short walk to the train station. "We only had to wait overnight for a train. In a few days, you'll be back at home, right where you belong. You ought to be happy." Once, Amelia thought that hearing the news that her brother wanted her at home would bring her joy, but at this moment, she couldn't find any happiness inside her. She couldn't stop thinking about the conversation that had taken place in the Whitman yard between herself, Nelson, and Mr. Whitman the previous day. Her boss had commented being manipulated. The more she thought about it, the deeper the comment niggled. "I don't understand why you came back here for me." With a hearty sigh and a roll of his eyes, Nelson turned to his sister. "We don't have to go over this again, do we? The bakery needs you. Our family needs you. It's what Father would have wanted, so let's go. I already bought the tickets last night, so we don't have to wait in line." He turned back toward the station. Her feet refused to budge. "If the family and the bakery need me so much, then why did you get rid of me in the first place?" His back tightened under his shirt, and he glanced at her over his shoulder. "I didn't get rid of you." "Certainly you did. You insisted I move out, that I couldn't possibly stay any longer because Blanche didn't want me there. Then you insist that I move back in, that you can't live without me, and Blanche has changed her mind. How can that be? How can someone who has so openly despised me for so long suddenly decide that she wants me under her roof again?" She could see the irritation in his eyes, and she knew that all of this was only going to make the train ride home miserable for her. But if she didn't ask now, then she never would. He set both valises down and took her by the shoulders, his eyes drilling into hers. "Amelia, I need you back. I'm sorry that I upset you, and I'm sorry that you came across the country to find a different job. But I can't run this bakery without you. Blanche refuses to do any of the work. What work she does is terrible. The woman can't bake a simple biscuit. She doesn't seem to know how to make change at the cash desk, and she refuses to pick up a broom. The best position for her is as the lady of the house, and so that's what I'm going to make happen." Her eyes narrowed dangerously. "Hold on, Nelson. What about the takings?" "They've fallen, of course, but I'm having to do everything." She blinked a few times, digesting the information. "You lied?" He winced, his right hand lifting off her shoulder to wobble in the air. "No, I didn't lie. When you're there, I get time at home with my wife. Blanche needs me there. She wants to hold dinner parties and host grand events. I have to cater for those." "Hire someone then?" "I did." She saw by the way his eyes widened that he'd not meant to say that to her. "I hired a young woman, thinking that she would replace you." "What happened to her?" Her brother squirmed, and she pressed him for an answer. "Blanche believed that I was going to cheat on her with the poor young girl." Nelson laughed as if the idea was absurd. Amelia shrugged off her brother's hands and glared up at him. "What did you do, Nelson?" "Nothing," he replied in a whiny voice, though judging by the twin spots of red that appeared on his face, she knew that he was lying. "Try that again, and the truth this time. I'm bound to find out when I get home, Nelson, so you may as well tell me everything now." He slipped his hands in his pockets and toed the ground. "I swear I didn't do anything wrong, but mud sticks. People have stopped coming to the bakery. Because of what you did to her?" "I didn't do anything to her," he bellowed, his face redder. Several people stopped to watch them. Amelia didn't care. It was as if the blinkers had fallen away from her eyes. The bakery is failing because of something you did, Nelson. If you come home, it will restore everyone's faith. They all think I chased you away. You did, Amelia exploded. You sent me away from the house and told me to marry someone, anyone, all because your wife didn't like having another woman about. You then thought it was wise to bring in a different woman. Goodness only knows what you did or didn't do, but that's not my problem. My marriage is in trouble, Amelia. Just come home and fix the bakery so I can fix my marriage. Your marriage is failing because your wife is jealous and you're selfish. Amelia vibrated with anger. You drive me away, and then you insist that I come back home because you just want me to help you make money, fix the bakery that you ruined less than 6 months, and all to keep your wife happy? What about what makes me happy? Baking makes you happy. Come home. You can bake to your heart's content. You know that your crusts are better than mine. She knew that they were, but didn't much care for his poor attempt at flattery when it wasn't sincere. I'm not doing it, Nelson. Of course you are. You already said you would, and it's what Father would have wanted. Is it? Yes, his dream was to have the bakery that everyone went to. That's what he built, and it's what he left to us. To you, Nelson, not me. To us, he insisted as he reached for her once more. She danced back from him, shaking her head. Stop trying to guilt me into it. Mr. Whitman was right. You're just trying to manipulate me. Nelson's eyes narrowed, and his small smile was cruel. Oh, I see. What do you see? Something is going on between the two of you. Excuse me? Her heart fluttered at this tiny exposure of the truth. She cared for Mr. Whitman, probably far more than she should. I should have seen it, Nelson murmured. How territorial he was over you yesterday, though I must admit, I can't see the attraction of him, Amelia. At least David Brubaker didn't drag his knuckles along the floor like that troglodyte. She knew that her brother was trying to goad her. It was what he always did when he thought he'd found a weakness, and she refused to take the bait. Amelia tried to pull the focus back to the matter at hand. You're not ever going to change, Nelson. You'll just use me for whatever purposes suit you. You'll bring me back to the bakery, and then when Blanche gets tired of me, or you give her a baby, which is probably where your tiny little mind is going when you're trying to think of how to solve this problem, you'll just send me away again. You want to talk about an obligation to the family, but you don't see the obligation that I have here. Sheridan has already become my home. The people here are far more accepting of me than my own family has been. I work hard at my job, but I know that I'm truly appreciated in everything I do. They just want their bellies full, and that's no different than the customers at the bakery. Seriously, Amelia, you're putting far too much stock in your position at that log cabin, he said with a roll of his eyes. It's just a job. Whitman will have you replaced by the end of the day. Amelia's lips trembled at the thought. Would he really do that? Would Mr. Whitman just put out another advertisement and find someone else, maybe even someone who would do a better job than she did? She'd learned a lot, and she'd come a long way. She loved the people of the Whitman Ranch, as well as the neighbors and the people in town. Did she mean anything to them? A blaze of anger burned in her. Nelson might be able to convince her to leave with talk of their father, but he knew nothing about what things were like here in Wyoming. Well, it's not the end of the day yet. With her fists curled and her cheeks hot, she whirled away from him and ran straight into a hard wall. Strong hands grabbed her arms as she reeled backward. Amelia looked up to find herself in Mr. Whitman's arms. His blue eyes, which could be tender and caring when he chose, were currently blazing. Her palms rested along his chest, and she could feel the muscles moving under her palms. Matthew, she whispered. He tore his eyes away from Nelson. His gaze searched her face, and she felt a little of the tension in his body ease. His firm-cut mouth tipped up a little around the edges. Hello, Miss French. His voice sent tremors through her as her heart stumbled over itself in her chest. What are you doing here? Looking for you, he murmured. Amelia, Nelson barked at her. Her brother's shout doused them both. Matthew gently set her aside as if she was a piece of fine porcelain. Amelia turned and looked at Nelson. She caught the whiff of desperation that swirled around him. You have a duty to the bakery. She cocked a brow. Nelson, you claim to have father's business sense, yes? Nelson's head bobbed. Naturally. Can you tell me how much profit the bakery made last year? Nelson's mouth opened, closed, and opened again. Not off the top of my head, no. How about operational costs then? Do you know that? Papa sat us both down every quarter. He went through the account books and showed us both how to make them balance. You don't need me there to help you run the business. You were shown the same things I was. Papa just left everything to you because he believed his son was the one worthy enough and that I would be taken care of by my husband should I ever choose to marry. You're spouting nonsense, he snapped. You will honor your word and come home with me. I have bought tickets. You mind your tone, Matthew interjected. I'm not going to stand here and argue with you again, Whitman. Nelson warned. Good, Matthew replied. Prosody. I can't say I'm in the mood to argue either. Miss French will come with me, and you'll head on back to Greenville. You don't have any right, Nelson growled. Mr. Whitman nodded slowly, tucking his thumbs into the pockets of his trousers. I was thinking about that. Someone asked me a question last night, and it made me realize that neither one of us have a right to make a decision that will have consequences for your sister. Blue eyes lit up with tenderness, and Amelia had to swallow quickly. Miss French, the choice is yours. Amelia? Matthew swung up a finger and pointed it at Nelson, quelling any further comment when he then laid the finger against his mouth. Her blood raced in her veins as she looked up at him. He'd become so familiar to her. It was the kind of familiarity that made her feel warm and comfortable inside, like the sun setting over the pastures. That soft look had returned to his eyes, touched with worry. He thought there was a chance she might leave him, Amelia realized. Oh, but now that he was here, she knew she could never be anywhere else. Mr. Whitman had given her the one thing she'd never felt that she had before, a choice. He wasn't demanding that she stay or leave, nor was he trying to make her feel bad about it either way. It was up to her, but she knew there was only one thing she could ever say. I want to go home. Matthew flinched and he nodded, even as she caught the wince. I meant the ranch. That's my home now. Matthew's smile spread across his face, slow and steady, just like he was with her. Amelia, Nelson warned. Staying close to Matthew, Amelia addressed her brother. Nelson, I'm sorry that things are going poorly for you at home. I do hope that things turn around for you, but I'm not the one who can change it. You and Blanche will need to work that out for yourselves and live with your own decisions. Meanwhile, I'm going to make my own life here. I wish you all luck in the world, but that isn't my life anymore. Please, give Mama my love. She kept her back straight and her chin in the air, prepared for yet another rebuttal. She felt Matthew's arm brush her shoulder as he aligned himself next to her. She exhaled shakily. For the first time in the longest time, she felt as if she wasn't alone anymore. Nelson's gaze flickered back and forth between the two of them for a moment. His jaw clenched. Fine, he finally ground out. He looked as though he might say more, but he snagged his valise from the ground and stomped off toward the platform. Calmly, Matthew picked up Amelia's bag. Is there anywhere you need to stop while we're in town? No, she said with a smile. Please just take me home. Chapter 12. Amelia dished up big bowls full of grits and carried them out into the dining room as the men came in. Her cheeks were hurting, but it was only because she couldn't stop smiling. She thought she might have smiled all night long in her sleep, in her little room up under the eaves. There was nothing better than being back here at the Whitman Ranch. Good morning, she said, as Fletcher, Michael, and Joel each took a seat. I hope you all slept well. The men nodded politely, but Amelia didn't miss the glances that they shared. Sweeping back into the kitchen, Amelia returned a moment later with fresh bacon and fried eggs. She happily put a plate down in front of Arlie. Do you have a busy day planned? The chief ranch hand was the only one who didn't seem to be acting strangely. He stroked his fingers through his thick beard and smiled. I always do, but that's what keeps me young and spry. That and your fine cooking. Thank you, Arlie. That's very kind of you. Amelia set down a pitcher of cream and was about to head back into the kitchen when Matthew walked in. She paused when she saw him, his face so intense. Their eyes held for a long moment, and she curled her mouth up at him slightly before she whisked back through the door to get the rest of breakfast. There was little more than idle chit-chat as the men drank their coffee and ate their breakfasts, with Amelia popping in now and then to make sure they'd had enough to eat. The hands would look up at her with hope and worry. Arlie would grin. Mr. Whitman would either fix her with that powerful gaze or avoid looking at her entirely. Amelia wasn't entirely certain how she felt about that, but she was very certain that she was happy to be back on the ranch. Her relationship with Mr. Whitman had been like this from the very beginning. He would be friendly and welcoming one minute, but angry and distant another. She knew that much of it had to do with the losses he'd suffered and the weight he carried on his shoulders of running the ranch. He could be surly and rough, but he always came around eventually. A small voice of doubt in the back of her mind wondered if he regretted chasing her down at the train station to bring her back, but she silenced it with a clang of the pots and pans in the sink. When she heard the door open behind her, she forced herself not to look. After all, she was right where she belonged and doing what she was supposed to be doing. Mr. Whitman wanted her here, even if she made a few mistakes, and she no longer needed to concern herself with what happened back home in Greenville. "Miss French?" His voice was deep and low behind her. She gave a half glance back over her shoulder. Miss French, the formality of it told her that he simply saw her as an employee. He needed a cook. There was no reason that he'd waited at the train station yesterday morning, other than he needed a cook. She'd been deluding herself with fanciful thoughts that he harbored anything other than professional feelings toward her. "Do you need anything else, Mr. Whitman?" She didn't fully look at him, not trusting herself or her voice if she saw his aloofness right this minute. "I wanted to ask you something." "Okay, shoot. Could you stop that a moment and look at me?" "I have a lot to get through today, Mr. Whitman," she quipped in an overly bright tone. Drying off the pot, she moved to put it back on the rack, feeling his eyes on her. "Please, this will only take a moment." Her hands stilled while she strengthened her resolve not to cry in front of him again. She turned, meeting his eyes fleetingly, and then focusing on a spot over his shoulder. "Mr. Whitman," he seemed to hesitate, "are you still happy with the choice? To stay here, I mean. You gave up a lot for this place." She folded the drying cloth into a neat square as she said, "Of course, I have to wonder if everyone else is. Most of them seem a bit glum. I think they're just worried that you might leave again." His voice was scratchy, hesitant, as though there was more that he wanted to say. "They were mighty upset about it when you went with Nelson." Amelia finally met his eyes and felt the jolt of it to her core. "I was upset about it too. I never really wanted to go. I felt like I had to, like there was no choice. It was the same when I left Greenville. Nelson's new wife didn't want me around, and I was practically pitched out of the family home like kitchen scraps." "That's difficult to imagine." His finger traced the grain of the wood on the kitchen table. "I thought so at the time. I didn't know what to do with myself. And I didn't think I could ever find another place to belong. I was angry with him for forcing me to change my life, but now I'm glad. I've never been any place that felt as much like home as it does here." "That's good." He lifted his eyes to hers. His finger made a final tap on the table as he nodded. "Good." Mr. Whitman headed back out to the dining room. "Right. Well, I'll leave you to get on then." "Okay," she murmured, frowning at the door long after he'd walked through it. The rest of the day passed much as it usually did, with Amelia deciding on recipes, gathering supplies, planning, and preparing. The ranch hands were already returning more to themselves, joking and laughing at supper, but being mindful of their manners. Amelia guessed that much of this had to do with Mr. Whitman reassuring them that she was truly here to stay. If they'd asked, she'd have told them that there was truly no other place she wanted to be. That evening, when supper was finished and the dishes were washed, when there was little more for her to do except for a bit of mending, Amelia stepped out onto the front porch. She leaned on the railing and drew in a long breath of air that smelled of the lilacs that grew up the side of the house. The sky was purple at its zenith, the sun leaving a blend of magentas and oranges as it melted into the horizon. Before long, she would be able to see stars like pinpricks in the fabric of the night sky. The door squeaked behind her, and her skin prickled with awareness as she heard footsteps move toward her. She didn't have to turn to know Matthew was there. He appeared in her peripheral vision as he stood next to her at the railing. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" She smiled softly. "One could say that they're all the same, but they don't feel that way to me. I don't think I'll ever tire of watching them." "No? No. Every single one is special. Every single one is a moment to be grateful for and a bit of hope for the future. You know, I think that's why I kept you on here even after some of those terrible dinners." He moved slightly closer. Amelia faced him, amused. "Are you going to bring that up again?" "It's important," he insisted. The sinking sun burnished his eyes and highlighted the curve of his mouth. "You're always thinking like that, looking for the good in all that you face. At first, it annoyed me. I only ever saw the bad that life gave me. You bring life to this ranch in a way that I never thought possible." His words warmed her almost as much as being this close to him did. "Do you really think so?" "I know it. You can ask any one of the men who work for me, too. When they found out you were gone, you'd have thought they were at a funeral. And what about you?" It was too forward of a question, but she'd come too far to start holding back now. Amelia felt far bolder and braver than she'd ever been before. She'd wanted to come back to the ranch for the job, yes, but she could no longer deny that there were more reasons than that. He gazed out over the pastures for a moment before he looked back at her. "I'd like to ask you something." Answering her question with another question wasn't exactly what she'd expected, and she felt her stomach lurch. "Yes, Mr. Whitman? I suppose there are two things I'd like to ask you. The first is that you start calling me Matthew." She looked down and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, feeling shy. "I suppose I can work on that." "I certainly hope so, because it'll make the second favor much easier." He took each of her hands in his, gliding his fingers delicately over hers. "I'd like to know if you'd care to stay here on a more permanent basis, as my wife." "Your wife?" Her skin tingled where he touched her, her senses roaring to life as she was filled with a longing for him. "I like having you in my home, Amelia. I like waking up in the morning knowing that you'll be there, that you'll have some disaster that will make me smile. I'd like it more if you were the first thing that I was to see when I opened my eyes in the morning." Her tongue snaked out to wet my lips, and she caught the flare of desire reflected in the blue depths of his eyes. He lifted her hand to his mouth and brushed his lips across where his thumbs had awakened her. "Will you marry me? Because living with you drives me crazy, and yet I don't want it to be any other way." She could hardly believe the words. Amelia had known almost right away that she felt something for him, but she hadn't been sure that he'd felt it as well. Now, with his thumbs grazing over her knuckles, her body humming with pleasure from his touch, and so much hope in his eyes, she knew that they'd both been dancing around this for a long time. Coming back to the ranch had been like coming home. Coming back here as Matthew's wife was like a dream come true. "Yes, Matthew, I'd love to." Epilogue. "Be very careful. It'll break if you drop it." Amelia watched as little Madeline held the fresh chicken egg, transferring it back and forth between her pudgy hands. "Break?" she asked in her sweet little voice. "That's right, we don't want to break it open until we're ready to use it. Can you put it right there in your pocket?" Amelia tapped the generously sized pocket she'd sewn onto her daughter's apron for just such a task. "Keep it safe until we get it inside." Concentrating hard, Madeline slowly slipped the egg into her apron and patted it gently. "Egg in my pocky." With her basket of eggs in one hand, Amelia reached out with the other to hold on to Madeline's tiny fingers. "That's right, darling. Now let's go inside and work on finishing supper. Your father will be in soon." The girl's face immediately lit up. "Papa?" "Yes, he and the others will be coming in soon. They'll be hungry, and I've almost got supper ready." There was a time not all that long ago when Amelia had been completely intimidated by the idea of cooking a meal for so many people. These days, it all seemed to come so naturally to her. What had been the only way she'd found of escaping her brother's need to marry her off had turned out to be the best decision she'd ever made, other than agreeing to become Amelia Whitman, of course. Her life had changed completely. Yes, there was just as much hard work to do here as there had been back at the bakery. She rose early to get the fires going and the food started. In between meals, she was busy cleaning the house, taking care of laundry, tending the vegetable and herb patches, and feeding the chickens. Then, of course, there was Madeline. It had been an adjustment to care for a child while she continued with her other duties, but it was one that Amelia had gladly taken on. She'd fallen in love with her daughter from the moment she knew she existed. She'd carried her baby along with her as she'd attended to the needs of the household. Once she could walk, Madeline had begun toddling along after Amelia. The chores were done much more slowly now, but nobody minded. There'd been plenty of help when it came to motherhood, too. Sue had come just before the birth and had stayed for the entire first week. Fletcher had married a wonderful young woman named Faith, and she'd become fast friends with the other woman as she and her new husband built a cabin for themselves on the corner of the ranch. Mrs. Hart, who lived just down the road, had plenty of wisdom to offer when it came to child-rearing. Amelia found that she truly did belong here, and that Sheridan had become her home in the most wonderful way. Yes, her life had most certainly changed, but only for the better. Amelia inhaled the promising sweetness of spring as she and Madeline headed toward the house. "Papa," her daughter said, dancing around on the spot. "Yes, he'll be here soon. Be careful with that egg now." "Papa," Madeline insisted, yanking on Amelia's hand. Turning, she saw Matthew coming in from the pasture with Arlie at his side. Since Madeline was so excited, Amelia decided that supper could be a few minutes late. They waited in the yard while Matthew put up his horse, and then she let go of her hand when he strode out of the barn. "Papa." Madeline ran for him, stumbling a bit over a hummock of grass but quickly recovering. "Hey there, sweet cake!" Matthew caught her under her arms and swooped her up into the air, making her squeal with delight before he set her on his shoulder. "Have you been helping your mama?" "Can't break the egg?" She patted her pocket. "That's right, although I think I've broken a few of them before." Sprawling. Matthew stopped when he got to Amelia and bent to kiss her. "How has your afternoon been?" "Wonderful." She felt a surge of excitement within her, but she knew that what she needed to tell him would have to wait. The rest of their ranch family was coming in, and she had work to do. Inside, Madeline put her egg in the kitchen before she ran back off to see her papa. Amelia could hear them in front of the fireplace as she put the finishing touches on the meal, laughing and talking. She couldn't discern the words through the wall, but they didn't matter. The two of them were so close, and it made her heart so full. "Is there anything I can help you with?" Faith poked her head into the kitchen, having just come up from the cabin she shared with Fletcher. Amelia eyed Faith's growing belly, which now gave a distinct roundness to her figure. "I'm not sure you should be carrying anything. You're due any day now." Faith beamed and rubbed a hand over her swollen belly. "I know, Fletcher is so excited, it's the only thing he'll talk about." "You've certainly changed him," Amelia noted. Matthew had told her just how wild the ranch hand used to be, and he'd settled down quickly as soon as he'd met Faith. "Can I tell you something?" Faith bit her lip and glanced toward the closed kitchen door. "I'm a little bit scared." Amelia pulled her into her arms. "That's all right. I was too. I think all of us are. Even Mrs. Hart told me she still felt some apprehension about her last one, and she had 6. It's only natural, but we just have to put our trust in God that He'll take care of us. You've also got everyone else around here to take care of you, too." "Thank you." Looking a bit surer of herself, Faith carried the vegetables out to the dining room. At the table, Amelia couldn't help but revel in the noise and busyness of the household. The men shared stories of their accomplishments and failures throughout the day, laughing as the tale of Joel falling off of his horse was repeated for a second time. Madeline spent part of the meal on her father's knee, but she also got to tug on Uncle Arlie's beard. Faith spoke of the layette she was finishing for her child, and discussed how Sue had shown her some wonderful tricks with the needle that had truly saved her time. Amelia looked at her husband, surrounded by so much love and joy. She could see a different side to him than what he'd initially shown her when she came to the Whitman ranch, but she truly believed that she'd always known it was there. He was happy, and she hoped that what she had to tell him would only make him happier. She just had to wait for the right moment, which was getting harder and harder. With his fork halfway to his mouth, he noticed her looking at him. "Is something wrong?" he asked, leaning close to whisper. "You look upset." He smelled of spring breeze and sunshine, of a man who had put in a day of hard work and been happy to do it. "Not at all," she assured him. It was only much later, when the meal was done and the dishes had all been cleared away, that he took her by the hand and brought her out onto the porch. Madeline was inside, still playing with Arlie, and Fletcher and Faith had gone back to their cabin. The remaining hands had cleared out to the bunkhouse, and all was quiet again. The golden colors of the sunset spilled over their little piece of paradise as they leaned on the rail, and she could hear Madeline laughing happily inside. "We hardly ever have any time to be alone," Matthew said quietly. "Not that I mind all the wonderful people we're surrounded with, but you kept looking at me so strangely at the table. It made me worry." Amelia put her hands on his broad chest and looked up into his eyes, kneeling. Never in her lifetime would she find the right words to tell him just how much he meant to her. "I thought it might be that letter from North Carolina that came yesterday," Matthew continued, eyeing her carefully. "You rushed off back to work, but I noticed that you didn't open it, even though you said it wasn't Nelson's writing, or your mother's." She'd stuffed the envelope into her pocket when Matthew had returned from town with it, scared that it might contain bad news, and hurriedly got on with her chores. Her mother was advancing in years now. She'd made the trip to Wyoming twice, but Amelia knew that her mama was happy when it had come time to return east each time. His hand stroked her back in comfort. "Did you open it?" She nodded. Curiosity had gotten the better of her in the end. "With how busy I've been, I almost forgot about it, if I'm honest." Blanche wrote, "Nelson wasn't sure that I'd open a letter if I knew it was from him." She felt her husband tense, and he reared back, concern mixing with a little annoyance in his expression. "What did it say?" "It was a letter of contrition. She asked me for forgiveness. She explained that by sending Nelson home with his tail between his legs, I'd done them both a favor. It had made her do the work and my brother a better husband. She regrets what they did by sending me away, but not that I went away, because it gave them a better marriage." "Did she mention what Nelson was meant to have done to that poor girl?" "I think it's just as Mama said. He was chasing her around the dough table for a kiss. I can't see my brother being anything other than a menace. I think he's learned his lesson when the girl shouted from the rooftops what he did, as well she should." Matthew nodded. "He definitely is that. I'm glad that they've managed to salvage everything, though. It sounds like your mother gave them the same sage advice you did about business. Are you going to forgive them?" Amelia didn't even need to think about it. Of course. The pastor gave a sermon last month on forgiveness, to hold on to a grudge when I have so much to be thankful for. I only want light and joy in my heart, Matthew. Nelson and Blanche needed to find their way. I'll admit I wasn't sure that they'd find it together, but I'm glad that they have. I'm glad that the bakery has managed to survive too. I know that that would be important to Nelson. You have a kind heart. It's what draws everyone to you. She eyed him playfully. Wait a minute. Last week, you said that my stubborn nature drives you crazy, and I would test the patience of a saint, which you are most certainly not, considering the language you used as you stomped your way across the yard. Matthew growled and nuzzled her neck, drawing a giggle from her. You drive me crazy because you won't be bossed around. Even when I'm right and you don't like to admit it? I'm not answering that, Mrs. Whitman. She laughed then and batted him away. Matthew, anyone could look out of the bunkhouse, and they'll see a husband very much in love with his wife, and they'll mind their own business. Amelia kissed him and then set him away. Matthew, he sobered immediately, concern pulling at his brows. There is something that you're not telling me, isn't there? I knew it, he hissed when she nodded slightly. What else was in that letter? I could tell that something was troubling you. I swear, I'll ride east and... It's not the letter. Then what, Amelia? You're worrying me. She took his hand and pressed it against her stomach. There, he could feel the telltale swelling. His words died on his lips as he stared at her. The last time, he'd been so troubled by the news that they were expecting. He rarely talked about Jane or their son, but she knew that his first wife still held a piece of his heart. It's what made him a good husband and a wonderful father, because he cherished them each day as if it was the last. A child? She murmured. Another winter baby. Is that okay? Oh, sweetheart, of course. What did I do to be so blessed? He sent a prayer to the heavens and then folded his arms around her. And for once, Amelia didn't mind that they could be seen. She let herself enjoy the moment. Her husband in her arms, her daughter's joyful laughter in her ears, and a new child nestled within her, a sign that their union was indeed a blessing. The end.